Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I felt my phone buzz at 3 in the morning. I was lying on the couch unable to sleep because my mind wouldn't shut off. I work as a real estate agent, mostly dealing with old houses that need a lot of maintenance. People hire me because I know how to market historical properties without making them seem like money pits. But that night, I was too restless to go to bed. My phone's screen lit up the dark living room. I glanced at it and saw a number I didn't recognize. It had too few digits and the format was strange. My chest tightened and I rubbed my eyes to be sure I wasn't misreading. The text said, "Do you see me?" There was an attachment. I tapped on the attachment. It was a photo of a house I was trying to sell downtown. The place had been on the market for months. It needed a new roof and the wiring was ancient, but it had these interesting Victorian details that some people love. In the photo, though, the house didn't look right. The angles were off, like the structure was warped. The windows were dark except for one on the second floor. There was a figure standing there. I couldn't make out any details, but it looked tall and still, like a statue. I felt my skin prickle. A chill passed through my arms. I immediately checked the time. It was 3:02 a.m. My heart was beating faster than usual. I decided to block the number, but my hands were trembling, and I dropped my phone on the coffee table. I grabbed it again, fumbled with the settings, and pressed block. I tried to forget about it. I forced myself to lie down and stare at the ceiling until I drifted off. In the morning, I woke up feeling stiff. I got dressed and went to my office. The building is small, just me and a receptionist. I made a cup of coffee and tried to concentrate on the listings in my computer. I kept glancing at my phone, half hoping there wouldn't be another message. Around 9, I decided to do a reverse lookup on that number. I'm no tech wizard, but I know some websites that let you check phone records. I typed in the weird number. The result said it was invalid or disconnected. That didn't surprise me. Then I found an old newspaper reference to that same number from about 50 years ago. It said it had belonged to a small local business that handled antique furniture restoration. It closed decades ago. The phone line should have been long gone. My breathing went shallow. I felt sweat forming on my forehead. I told myself it must be a prank. Sometimes bored people find ways to mimic old caller IDs or something like that. I went back to my listings, tried to schedule a showing for a different property, and got lost in phone calls. By noon, I had almost convinced myself to ignore the strange text. I had enough to worry about. My sales numbers had been dropping, and I needed to close a deal soon to stay afloat. After lunch, I grabbed my jacket and drove out to that Victorian house to meet a potential buyer. The place sat on a quiet street filled with older homes. The yard was overgrown, with weeds poking through the sidewalk. I stood on the cracked porch steps, waiting. Nobody showed up. I tried calling the buyer, but it went straight to voicemail. I found myself staring at the second-floor window. In daylight, the house looked normal enough. The paint was chipped and the shutters were loose. I unlocked the front door and went inside. The interior smelled musty, like old wood and stale air. I walked through the empty rooms, checking for any signs of vandalism. It was quiet, except for the hum of distant traffic. I paused in the living room. The floorboards creaked under my shoes. I remembered the figure in the photo. I felt my stomach knot. I realized I was holding my breath. I swallowed hard and forced myself upstairs. The second floor had 3 bedrooms. 2 were empty, but the third had some leftover furniture from a previous owner. A dresser and a sagging mattress on the floor. The window overlooked the street. I stepped closer and stared outside. The sun was bright, and the breeze rustled the branches on an old oak tree in the front yard. Everything seemed normal. I took a deep breath, walked back downstairs, locked up, and left. That afternoon, I met another client at a different house across town. It's an early 20th century craftsman with a decent yard and a big porch. As we walked through it, my phone vibrated. I glanced down and felt a wave of dread. It was the same number. I hesitated but decided to ignore it so I could finish the showing. My client was an older man looking for an investment property. I showed him the living room, the kitchen, the upstairs bedrooms, and we talked about roofing costs and foundation issues. My phone buzzed again. I tried not to let it show on my face. After he left, I sat on the porch steps. I opened the messages. There were 2 texts. One said, "I'm still here." The next had a photo attached. It was the same craftsman house I was standing in, but the photo was taken at night. The windows were lit with a pale glow, but inside I saw dark shapes like silhouettes leaning against the glass. My hands shook. My throat felt dry. The hairs on the back of my neck rose. I scanned the street, half expecting to see someone pointing a camera at me. There was nobody around, just a couple of passing cars. I tried calling the number. It rang once, then nothing. Silence. I stared at my phone, waiting. No answer. My stomach churned. I grabbed my bag and locked up the house. On the drive back to the office, I kept checking my rearview mirror. I felt jumpy, like every car behind me might be following. My legs were tense, and my foot pressed the gas pedal harder than normal. That evening, I tried to relax at home. I sat at the kitchen table staring at my phone. I had a laptop open, searching for any traces of that old company that had used the phone number. It was called Bristol & Sons Restoration or something like that. I found a couple of references in old archives. Nothing scandalous, no big stories. It just vanished around 50 years ago. I sighed and rubbed my temples. Then the phone buzzed again. I nearly knocked over my water glass as I grabbed the phone. The text said, "Why did you leave?" I tapped on the photo. It was the inside of the craftsman house's living room, but the walls were warped, the corners bending. There was a shape in the corner that looked almost human but blurred. My hands felt clammy. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I looked around my own living room expecting something to jump out. It was silent. I closed the curtains. I tried to breathe slowly. My mouth was dry and my palms were sweaty. I turned off my phone. I wanted to disconnect from everything. I sat there for a while, my pulse racing. Eventually, I forced myself to get up and double-check all the locks in my apartment. I made sure the windows were secured. I felt a little better after that, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The next morning, I went straight to the phone company's local branch. I waited in line until a representative called me over. I showed them the number and asked if it was possible that this line was still active. The rep typed on her computer, then frowned and said it was deactivated a long time ago. I asked if anyone could spoof it. She shrugged and said there were ways, but it would take some effort. I asked if she could trace the texts. She said they'd need a request from law enforcement for anything like that. My chest felt tight. I nodded and left. Outside, the air was cool. Cars passed by on the busy street. I decided to stop by a local historian's office. I know a guy there who sometimes helps me with background information on old houses. Maybe he had heard of the people who owned that phone line. I walked into the old municipal building, found his small office, and explained what was happening. He looked confused, then searched in a few dusty files. He told me the business had been located near the historic district, but closed around 50 years ago, just like I'd read. He didn't have anything else. No known heirs, no big lawsuits, no tragedies that he knew about. I thanked him and left, feeling stuck. When I got back to my office, there was a note on my desk from my receptionist. She said a client had called to cancel a showing. The reason wasn't clear. I tried calling them back, but no response. Then my phone vibrated. Another text from the same number. "Check your email." I felt my stomach twist. I didn't remember giving my email to whoever this was. I opened my email on the computer, and there it was, a single new message with no subject line. Inside it said, "I see you." There was a photo attached. I clicked it. It showed the front of my office building, taken from across the street. I saw the sign, the brick walls, and my own car parked out front. I felt my throat tighten. I stood up and rushed to the window. I looked outside, scanning for someone with a phone or camera. A few people were walking by, but nobody seemed to be aiming anything at me. My hands felt cold. I shut the window blinds. I tried to focus on my work for the rest of the day, but I couldn't think straight. My mind kept going back to the photos of those houses with figures in the windows. I typed out a response to the email. "Who are you?" I hit send, then stared at the screen. No reply. In the late afternoon, I decided to do something I'd been avoiding. I drove back to the Victorian house. I wanted to check every corner, see if someone had been sneaking in to take those photos. Maybe it was a disgruntled seller or a bored trespasser. My heart hammered as I parked out front. The air was still, and the sky was cloudy. The house looked lifeless. I pulled out my keys and opened the front door. The smell of dust and old wood greeted me again. I flipped on my flashlight, even though it was still light outside. The corners of the rooms were dim. I walked around slowly, checking closets, looking behind doors. The house was empty. The floors groaned under my weight. My breath sounded louder than usual. I made my way upstairs again. The furniture was still there in the third bedroom. I looked at the dresser. I opened a drawer. Empty. I checked the mattress. Just stained fabric and old springs. I swallowed and felt a shiver at the base of my neck. I heard a faint buzzing from my pocket. I pulled out my phone. A new text. "Behind you." My chest tightened and I spun around, raising my flashlight. Nothing. Just a bare wall. My pulse pounded. I could hear my own breathing echo in the empty room. I stepped into the hallway, shining my flashlight into every corner. Nobody was there. I felt sweat trickling down the sides of my face. I clenched my teeth and hurried downstairs. I stepped outside, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I stood on the porch, gulping in fresh air. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a photo. It showed the hallway I had just walked through at the exact moment I'd been looking around with my flashlight. I could see my own back in the frame, as though someone had been right behind me. I felt dizzy. My legs felt weak and I leaned against the railing. My mind raced with thoughts. I wanted to call the police, but what would I say? That I was getting text messages from a 50-year-old disconnected line? Maybe they'd think it was a hoax. Maybe it was a hoax. But the photos felt too real. I drove away, hands trembling on the steering wheel. I couldn't stay at the office or that house any longer. I went straight home, locked the door, and sat on my couch. I turned on all the lights. The clock said 7 p.m., but it was getting dark outside. My phone was silent for a while. I kept checking it, waiting. My nerves were shot. I felt restless, so I paced around my living room. I finally sat down at the kitchen table with a notebook, trying to jot down everything I knew. The text messages, the photos, the houses involved, the old phone number. I wrote down the name of that defunct furniture restoration place. I tried to see if there was a pattern. Each property was at least 80 years old. They all had some historical significance. None of them had sold yet. And each photo showed shadowy figures or a warped version of the house. Around 9, my phone lit up with another text. My heart pounded. I picked it up. The text said, "You can't hide them forever." There was another attachment. I opened it. It was a picture of my apartment building from outside. The windows were all dark except for mine, glowing with the overhead light I had turned on. In the corner of the photo, there was a shape. It looked like a person standing in the parking lot. The figure was just a black outline, but I could tell it was facing my window. My stomach dropped. I rushed to the window and peered down. The parking lot was empty, just a few cars. My knees felt weak. My breathing came in quick bursts. I grabbed my phone and typed a message back. "What do you want?" I felt my hands shaking as I hit send. I stood there, staring at the phone, waiting for a reply. Nothing came. Minutes ticked by. The only sounds in my apartment were the low hum of the refrigerator and my own breathing. I checked the locks again, then paced in circles. I felt adrenaline pumping in my veins. My heart was racing. At around 10, my phone buzzed. I jerked my head and snatched it off the table. The text said, "Stop selling them." Another attachment. I tapped on it. It was a photo of the newest listing I had just taken on that morning, an old Tudor-style house on the outskirts of town. The windows were pitch black, and there was a tall silhouette in one of them. I could see a faint outline of what looked like a hand against the glass. I clenched my jaw. My chest felt tight again. I realized I had to decide what to do next. I was too shaken to ignore it anymore. I sat on the couch, phone in hand, waiting to see if another text would come. I wanted to call someone, but I had no idea who could help. My stomach churned, and my muscles felt sore from all the tension. I glanced around my apartment, noticing how small it felt now. I realized I was sweating. I turned on the AC and tried to calm down. I never got another text that night. I barely slept, jumping at every sound in the hallway outside my door. When I finally closed my eyes, I kept seeing those distorted photos, the silhouettes in the windows, that bizarre figure right behind me in the hallway. My alarm jolted me awake at 6 in the morning. My head throbbed, and my eyes felt heavy. I checked my phone, half expecting more messages. There were none. Now I'm sitting here, sipping coffee, heart pounding. I keep checking the time, waiting for some new notification. I have no idea how this will end, or what that old phone number has to do with these houses. I just know that whoever is sending these messages wants me to stop selling them. And I don't know why. My body feels tense all over. My hands are shaky. I can't focus on anything else. I've decided to pull every old listing I have. I'm going to tell my clients I need some time. I don't know if that will solve anything, but I can't handle more photos of warped rooms and faceless figures. I keep glancing at my phone, waiting for another buzz. So far, nothing. I'm not sure if that scares me more or less. I just feel stuck, like I can't escape this. I'm looking outside my window right now. Everything seems normal. Cars pass by. People go about their day, but I can't shake the dread. The images of those houses cling to my mind. I see that blurry figure whenever I close my eyes. My back still tingles where I imagine someone standing behind me. I don't know what happens next. I only know I'm done with old properties for a while. Maybe I'll try to sell condos or commercial buildings instead. I don't care about commissions right now. I just want this to stop. I keep checking the hallway outside my apartment door, expecting someone to be there with a camera. The air in here feels suffocating. My heartbeat is loud in my ears. This is my life now, surrounded by silent tension and the fear of one more notification. And that's all I can say. I'm just waiting to see if there's another photo, another text, another demand. My phone is on the table. It's face down. I'm too scared to flip it over. I'm bracing myself for whatever comes next. That's the whole story so far. I don't know if it ends here, but I feel like something is still watching. I can't prove it. I just feel it in the way my skin crawls, even when I'm alone. So that's it. That's everything. And I don't know what else to do. I still remember the first time I heard someone ask for room 8113. It was a Thursday night around 9 p.m. I was at the front desk, leaning on the counter, checking some invoices. A man walked in, looked around like he was trying to size up the place, and then approached me. His shirt was wrinkled and he held a small suitcase that seemed about to burst. He asked for a room, but not just any room. He insisted on room 813. I told him we only have 3 floors and our rooms go up to 310. There's no 8th floor, and there's no room 8113. He glanced at the elevator, then at me, and shook his head. He repeated that he needed room 8113. He didn't explain why. He didn't raise his voice. He just repeated the same request in a calm but firm tone. I tapped the computer keyboard to show him the floor plan on the screen. I told him again, in a clear voice, that room 8113 doesn't exist in our hotel. He stared at the screen for a few seconds without blinking. Then he sighed and said he would settle for whatever room was available. I handed him a key to room 307. He thanked me, walked to the elevator, and disappeared behind the old steel doors. I felt uneasy the moment they closed. I couldn't understand why he was so fixated on a room that didn't exist. At first, I brushed it off as a weird request. People sometimes have strange habits or preferences. I went back to my invoices and tried to concentrate on the numbers. But for the rest of my shift, every time the elevator dinged, I braced myself for that man to come back and ask again for 8113. Later that night, around 2 a.m., the phone rang. It was the desk phone, an internal call from a room extension. I glanced at the screen. It said 8113. I stared at that number for a few seconds. My heart began to thump. I reminded myself that it had to be a glitch. Maybe our old phone system had some bug. The phone kept ringing, so I picked it up. All I heard on the other end was a faint static noise. No words, no breathing, just static. I said, "Hello?" a few times. No answer. Then a click. The line went dead. I put the receiver back in place. I felt a chill on the back of my neck. I rubbed the sides of my arms and tried to convince myself it was just a technical error. The phone system was old, and we'd had some issues before with random extensions showing up incorrectly. But seeing 813 on the screen shook me. I stared at the phone for a long moment, waiting for it to ring again. It stayed silent. Around 3 a.m., I decided to walk around the lobby and check the common areas. That's part of my routine on slower nights. I strolled around, checking that the lounge chairs were neat, making sure the front doors were locked from the inside, and then I took the elevator to the second floor. I wanted to look in on the corridors, just to see if everything was okay. It was quiet. The carpeted hallway absorbed my footsteps, so I only heard a soft thud with each step. I passed room 203, 204, 205, and kept going. Everything looked normal. I stopped near the elevator to glance out the window at the empty street below. That's when I noticed a strange glow at the far end of the hallway. It looked like the reflection of a ceiling light, but it was too bright for that. I walked toward it, feeling a knot form in my stomach. I thought maybe a bulb was flickering. As I got closer, I saw a door at the end of the hallway. This hotel doesn't have a room at the end of that hallway. The last room is 210. But I was staring at a door with the number 8113 in brass letters. I froze in place. My hands felt clammy. I could feel my pulse in my ears. I took a few steps forward, squinting at that number. It was definitely 8113. The door looked slightly newer than the other doors. It was smooth, with a more modern handle. I hesitated. I wasn't sure if I should approach it, but curiosity pulled me forward. I reached out to touch the doorknob. It felt cold. I heard a strange hum like the buzz from an electrical panel. My head started to pound, so I blinked and shook it off. Then the hallway lights flickered once, and when I looked at the door again, it was gone. The entire wall was just a blank stretch of wallpaper. I was left with my hand hovering in the air, touching nothing. I let out a shaky breath and backed away. My knees felt weak. I tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe I was exhausted and seeing things, but I was certain of what I'd seen. I even felt the cold doorknob under my palm. The rest of my shift was uneventful, but I couldn't stop thinking about that door. I returned to the lobby, sat behind the desk, and stared at the phone. The man who checked in earlier never came down that night. The next morning, I found him at checkout time, waiting by the desk. He gave me his key and asked if he could stay another night. I told him we had availability, and he nodded. But then he repeated his request for 813. I said no. We don't have that room. He stayed quiet for a few seconds, then told me he'd keep his current room. He walked off without any explanation. I wanted to ask him if he'd called the front desk the previous night. I wanted to ask him if he'd seen or heard anything unusual, but the way he looked at me made me hesitate. He had a flat, disinterested gaze. There was no warmth there, no curiosity. It was like he already knew the answer. That night, I prepared for my shift with a sense of dread. I came in around 7 p.m., took over for the afternoon manager, and pretended everything was fine. I watched the lobby, greeted guests, and tried to keep busy. By 10 p.m., I was alone with the night bellhop. He usually dozed off in the small staff room, so I didn't mind him. At around 11 p.m., I got another call on the desk phone. The display showed 813. My heart pounded. I stared at it, unsure if I should answer. But after a few rings, I picked up. Again, just static. It hissed softly in my ear. I tried speaking, but nothing. Then a click. Line dead. I decided to investigate. I thought maybe the phone in room 307 was malfunctioning, and somehow the system was labeling it as 813. I checked the occupancy list and saw the same man was still in 307. He hadn't left. I picked up a master key and went upstairs. The hallway was dim. The lights flickered at random intervals, but that was normal for our old wiring. I went straight to 307. I knocked. After a moment, he opened the door halfway and looked at me. He didn't say anything. I asked him if he'd tried calling the front desk. He said no. I asked if his phone was working. He said he never used it. He just shrugged. I asked if I could test it. He stepped aside. I walked in and picked up the receiver. I listened. I heard the standard dial tone. I pressed the button for the front desk extension. The desk phone downstairs rang, and I hung up. Everything seemed normal. He said nothing. He stared at me with that calm, unreadable look. I thanked him and left. Once I got back to the lobby, I decided to check the phone system logs. We have a small panel behind the desk that shows which room calls come from. Sure enough, there was a record of 2 calls from extension 813 that night. There wasn't a single mention of 307. I felt a chill run through my arms. I closed the panel and went back to the front desk. That's when I noticed the corridor leading to the rear exit looked longer than usual. Our building isn't big, so that corridor should only run about 20 feet. But I was seeing it stretch out, like it went on for at least 40 or 50 feet. The light at the far end flickered. I took a few steps toward it, fighting the urge to run back to my desk. My ears started ringing, and my mouth went dry. As I approached the end, I saw a door on the right that shouldn't be there. It had the number 8113 again. The same brass numerals. The same newer style of wood and handle. I paused, breathing heavily. I looked behind me to see if anyone else was there. I was alone. I wanted to call out, but I stopped myself. It felt pointless. I reached for the doorknob. It was cold. The door felt solid under my hand, not like an illusion. I tried to open it, but it was locked. I stood there for a few seconds, my heart hammering. Then I heard the desk phone ring from far away. The hallway lights flickered. I turned toward the phone. When I looked back at the door, it was gone. The corridor was back to its normal length. I stumbled back to the front desk, panting. The phone had stopped ringing by then. That entire night I kept seeing small changes in the architecture. Sometimes the lobby seemed to tilt slightly. Sometimes a door on the second floor shifted a few inches to the right. I'd blink and it would be normal again. My stomach churned with anxiety. I felt sweaty and restless. I tried to keep busy with paperwork, but my eyes kept drifting to the phone. It stayed quiet until morning. The next day, the same man appeared in the lobby around noon. He looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes. He said he was checking out. He settled his bill and handed me his key. I felt the urge to ask him more about his request for 813. Something told me he knew something I didn't, but I couldn't form the words. He just stared at me for a moment, then walked away with his suitcase. I watched him leave through the glass doors. That evening, I thought maybe everything would go back to normal. The man was gone, and maybe the calls would stop. Around 10 p.m., I started to feel a headache coming on. I took a quick walk around the lobby to distract myself. The phone rang again, from extension 8113. This time I felt my blood rush to my face. I grabbed the phone and practically shouted, "Who is this?" Static. Then a strange whisper, like someone trying to speak through layers of cloth. I couldn't make out words. I waited, and then a click. Deadline again. I slammed the phone down and decided I needed to do a full check of every floor. I couldn't rest until I proved to myself that 8113 wasn't real. so I took the elevator to the third floor. I paced up and down the hallway looking at each door number, 301, 302, 303, and so on. Everything was normal. I moved to the second floor. Same routine. Everything seemed fine. I stood near the elevator, waiting, feeling the old carpet under my shoes. A slight buzzing sound came from the lights overhead. Then I spotted a door at the very end of the corridor. It was 813 again. I marched over, determined to open it this time. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel my lips trembling. The door felt solid. I pulled out the master key. The lock turned, but when I pushed, the door wouldn't budge. It felt like something was blocking it on the other side. I leaned my shoulder against it, pushing harder. The handle rattled. Then I heard a loud thump from inside the room, like a piece of furniture falling over. My blood ran cold. I stepped back, unsure of what to do. The door slammed shut on its own, and the numbers 8113 flickered like they were made of tiny bulbs. Then the entire door vanished in the blink of an eye. I was left staring at an empty wall. My legs shook as I made my way back to the elevator. I pressed the button repeatedly, almost frantic. The elevator took forever to arrive. The moment the doors opened, I jumped in and went down to the lobby. I felt lightheaded and my shirt was damp with sweat. I couldn't concentrate on anything for the rest of the night. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow looked suspicious. At around 4 a.m., I convinced myself to sit down and wait for daylight. I didn't want to walk around anymore. Over the next few nights, the phone calls kept coming. Always the same extension. Sometimes I'd answer and I'd hear that static or faint whisper. Sometimes I'd let it ring and it would eventually stop. During my rounds, I sometimes saw that door appear at the end of a hallway, in corners of the lobby, even once outside near the delivery entrance. It always looked the same, and whenever I tried to open it, it wouldn't move. Sometimes it disappeared the second I blinked. Other times I'd stand there staring until my eyes hurt, and then a light would flicker and it would be gone. I started double-checking the building plans. I went through old files in the back office. There's no record of any 8th floor. There's no mention of a room 813. Our building is only 3 stories tall. The phone system has no extension 8113 in the manual. None of it made sense. I felt trapped in a cycle of confusion and fear. I couldn't quit my job, but every night I dreaded coming in. My boss didn't believe me when I tried to explain. He said I was overworked. He told me to take a vacation if I needed it, but I couldn't walk away. I kept telling myself I had to figure out what was going on. Eventually, the phone calls slowed down. By the 4th week, I only got 1 call a night. Then they stopped entirely. The door sightings also became less frequent. I only saw it once every other night, and it always vanished before I could get close. After about 2 months, it stopped appearing altogether. I started to relax. I tried to push it out of my mind. I forced myself to believe it was over. Then, late one night, I was alone in the lobby, reading the shift notes. It was quiet. No guests were wandering around. The phone hadn't rung in hours. I suddenly felt that cold sensation behind my neck again. I turned around and saw it. There, right behind the front desk, where the manager's office door should be, was a door with the number 8113. It looked freshly painted. The handle gleamed under the fluorescent light. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. I considered running. I wanted to run, but I felt drawn to it. I stepped toward the door, my palms sweating. I rested my hand on the doorknob. It was cold. I hesitated, then turned the knob slowly. It opened a crack. I heard that faint buzz from inside. I leaned forward, peering into the dark. My stomach twisted and I felt a wave of nausea. Then the door slammed shut on its own, nearly catching my hand. I jumped back. A second later, the door was gone, replaced by the normal manager's office door, complete with the manager's nameplate. I stood there, breathing heavily, feeling my heart race. I glanced at the phone. It was quiet. I backed away, not sure what to do. My entire body was shaking. My mind raced. but I couldn't think of any logical explanation. I realized in that moment that whatever is behind room 814, I'll never fully understand. It shows up, then it disappears. It calls me, but offers no reason. I still work at the hotel. I go through the motions every night, checking guests in, answering calls, doing my rounds. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I catch a glimpse of a door with the number 8113 down some hallway or near the stairwell. Whenever I try to look directly at it, it flickers out. I don't talk about it with anyone anymore. Nobody believes me anyway. But I know what I've seen. I know what I keep seeing. And every time the phone rings in the middle of the night, my hand trembles before I pick it up. Because I never know if it's coming from a room that shouldn't exist. And maybe, just maybe, one night, I'll open that door all the way. And I'm not sure what I'll find if I do. I first spotted the tapes on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the basement of the library sorting old boxes marked storage. The smell down there was always musty. My nose felt clogged, and dust clung to my sleeves. My eyes strained under the single fluorescent light that flickered overhead. I remember pulling a cardboard box off a metal shelf. The top was taped shut, but the edges had softened with time. When I lifted it, I heard a faint rattle inside. I set the box on the floor and knelt down. I tore the tape off, opened the flaps, and found a stack of old cassette tapes labeled with crooked handwriting. Dates ranged from 1972 to 1975. I'm an archivist, so I deal with all sorts of materials. I've seen diaries, letters, newspaper clippings, and audio recordings, but these tapes looked different. The labels had names I didn't recognize, and a few had short notes in pencil, like Session 3 or Week 5. I felt a jolt of curiosity. My heart beat faster and my palms got a little damp. I liked finding things no one else had touched in decades. I peeled off one tape from the top. It had a faint coffee stain on the label. Jacob, July 11th, 1973. That was all it said. I carried the entire box to my workstation. The basement had a small table with an old cassette deck. I dusted off the machine. My mind raced with questions. Who was Jacob? Why did somebody keep these tapes in the library basement for so long? I stuck the first tape into the player. The sound crackled for a second and a distant voice came through. It was a man speaking. He sounded tired. Then I heard a woman's voice, calm and measured. She asked him to describe his feelings. I realized it was a therapy session. My throat felt tight. I glanced around, suddenly uneasy, like I was eavesdropping on something private. I listened to about 10 minutes. The man talked about his anxiety at work. The woman, probably his therapist, encouraged him to focus on how his job made him feel. I could hear the slight squeak of a chair whenever he shifted his weight. I felt awkward, but also pulled in. After a while, I decided to check another tape. Maybe they all belonged to the same person or the same therapist. I rummaged through the box. I saw names like Linda, Craig, Benson, and Jacob again. Each label had different dates, often spaced a week apart. I didn't see any official markers. There were no folders, no typed notes, just these tapes. I thought about my boss. He never mentioned any private recordings in the library's inventory. I figured I'd keep this discovery to myself until I knew more. I selected another tape labeled Jacob, August 1st, 1973, and slipped it into the deck. His voice came through again. This time he talked about guilt. He said something about avoiding his family, but he didn't say anything too specific. Then he mentioned a dream that kept coming back. I felt my stomach tense up when he described the dream's setting. A small house near the edge of a park with a tall fence. That detail made me pause. I grew up in a place like that, with a fence that felt massive. I rubbed my temples. I reminded myself that lots of people live in houses near parks. It didn't mean anything. I spent the rest of the afternoon flipping through the tapes. I listened to bits of Linda and Craig. They all seemed to be sessions with the same therapist. Her tone stayed level. She asked about their weeks, their conflicts, their fears. I felt a constant itch in the back of my mind. Something was off, though I couldn't place it. By the time I clocked out, I felt like I had crossed some boundary. My hands trembled a little when I thought about those old voices stuck on magnetic strips. I carried the box to my small office and locked it in a cabinet. That night, I went home. I live alone in a one-bedroom apartment. The floors creak and the heater only works half the time. I heated some leftover pasta, ate quickly, and tried to watch TV. My mind kept wandering back to those tapes. I felt a nervous energy in my legs. I kept shaking my foot. Eventually, I turned off the TV and sat on my couch in silence. I wondered if I'd made a mistake by listening, but I couldn't help wanting to go deeper. I told myself I'd just listen to a couple more the next day for work-related reasons. I was an archivist, after all. It was part of my job to catalog these things. In the morning, I got to the library earlier than usual. I headed straight to my office. The cabinet was still locked. I opened it, grabbed a handful of tapes, and brought them to my desk. I plugged in a small tape player I found in a back closet. The machine clicked when I pushed the play button. I tried one labeled Jacob, September 10th, 1973. He talked about a confrontation with someone named Mark. He said Mark accused him of lying. I felt a surge in my chest. I'd had a similar confrontation a few years ago. A co-worker named Mark once accused me of leaving out details in a project. But that was purely coincidence, right? People have the same names all the time. My brow furrowed and I rubbed my palms on my thighs. The next tape made me more uneasy. Jacob, September 17th, 1973. Jacob described a dream involving a corridor. He said the walls were covered with pictures he didn't recognize. At the end of the corridor, there was a door that wouldn't open. He felt trapped. I remembered having a nightmare like that. The thought made my scalp prickle. I leaned forward, elbows on the table, and listened carefully. My stomach clenched. Jacob said that in the dream he heard someone calling his name, but the voice sounded like it was his own voice echoing back. I paused the tape and took a shaky breath. I felt sweat on my forehead. I pressed play again, but the rest was just the therapist telling him to relax. At lunch, I felt drained. I barely tasted my sandwich. I replayed the details in my head, searching for any direct link to my life. I still told myself it was random. There must be thousands of dream scenarios out there. People dream about hallways all the time. But I couldn't ignore the tension in my chest. My breathing felt shallow. I returned to my office, deciding I'd try a tape from someone else. Maybe if I listened to Linda or Craig, I could forget about the similarities with Jacob. I picked a tape labeled Linda, October 2nd, 1973. She talked about a co-worker who kept undermining her. She described the exact dynamic I had with a colleague named Sabrina. I felt a chill go up my arms. Her story included a detail about a broken elevator that forced them to use the stairs every day. That happened in my building last year. I stared at the tape deck. My pulse pounded behind my ears. My thoughts raced. How could these tapes from the 1970s mirror my experiences? I took a deep breath and replayed the segment to check if I misheard. It was clear. She said she got stuck in that elevator, had to call maintenance, and then spent the next week walking up 4 flights of stairs. My mouth went dry. I tried to steady my breathing by counting to 10 in my head. I closed my eyes for a second, feeling the weight of the air around me. I decided to look for clues about the therapist. Maybe I could figure out who she was. I rummaged through the storage boxes. I found a small notebook tucked into the corner of the box. It had some scribbles, appointment times, random phone numbers, dates from the 70s. Nothing pointed to a specific name or location. The therapist's voice was calm, direct, and a little raspy. She sounded older, but I couldn't be sure. I checked old library records. There was no sign we had any partnership with a therapist back then. I found no reference to these sessions in our catalog. I couldn't focus on my normal work. I spent days listening to more of the tapes. I jotted down every detail that matched my life. It felt like a puzzle. Each time I recognized something, my heart rate spiked, and my breath got shallow. My back muscles got tight, and I had to stand up and stretch every half hour. The tapes were all from the early to mid-70s. The voices belonged to different people. Sometimes they talked about the city, about jobs, about relationships. I caught references to a building on Maple Street that sounded like the place I used to live. A man on a tape from 1974 mentioned a library with tall, narrow windows that sounded exactly like mine. I listened to that part 3 times, my eyes fixed on the tape deck. One afternoon, I heard a tape labeled Benson, March 3, 1975. He described tension with a supervisor named Clark. I once had a supervisor named Clark, and the problems sounded the same as mine: arguments about working late, confusion over who was responsible for certain tasks. I felt cold sweat on the back of my neck. I pulled a tissue from a box on my desk and wiped my forehead. My temples throbbed. Every story felt like a distorted version of my own experiences. The specifics weren't identical, but they matched enough to scare me. I started having trouble sleeping. My dreams began to overlap with what I heard on the tapes. I would dream about old furniture in a drab office and wake up with my chest pounding. I'd open my eyes, feeling the sheets damp around my legs. I'd switch on the light and stare at the ceiling, trying not to think about how real these tapes felt. I avoided telling anyone at work. I thought maybe I was losing my grip, mixing up the tapes with my memories. But the more I listened, the more I realized these details went beyond chance. One day I decided to record one of the sessions on my phone to analyze it later. I played back a part where Jacob described a scene in his basement from the previous week's session. He mentioned a clanging sound in the pipes whenever he turned on the faucet. I froze. My kitchen faucet makes the same noise, and my building's pipes are known to clang. I recognized the way he described the echo in the walls. My breathing grew faster. I stopped the tape and leaned back in my chair. My mind felt scrambled. I kept shaking my head, trying to clear it. But I couldn't forget the uneasy feeling in my stomach. It became an obsession. I spent hours alone in the basement or in my office, listening to these people talk about events that mirrored my own. I tried to track them on a timeline. I wanted to see if they matched the order of things that happened in my life. The sessions didn't line up perfectly, but they overlapped enough to leave me on edge. I felt a constant buzzing in my mind. My limbs felt heavy. My coffee intake went up because I struggled to stay alert. I felt like I was missing something. Why were these tapes even in the library? Who made them? Why did they describe pieces of my life decades before I was born? I considered calling someone, maybe a friend or a psychologist, to explain my situation. But I stopped every time. I worried they'd think I was imagining it. I had no proof except my word and these old tapes. I scanned the library archives, old newspapers, and city records. I tried to find references to group therapy sessions in the 70s that might have ended up in our basement. I found nothing useful. The tension kept building in my chest. I couldn't ignore it. My hands shook whenever I put a new tape into the player. One evening I stayed late at the library. The halls were quiet, and most of the lights were off. I sat in my office with a single desk lamp shining on the tape deck. I popped in one last tape for the night. Jacob, November 20th, 1973. He began by talking about feeling trapped in his job. Then he mentioned an incident with a coworker that matched something I went through last month. He even repeated a phrase I'd said in anger. "Don't twist my words." I heard my own voice in my head echoing that phrase. I felt my heart hammer. I jumped up from the chair and pressed a stop. My breath came in quick bursts. My arms felt weak. I picked up the tape and stared at the label. My throat felt tight. I thought about throwing it across the room. My eyes burned from lack of sleep. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights pressed on my ears. My muscles ached from sitting for so long. I looked at the time. It was past midnight. I realized how alone I was in the building. I turned off the tape deck, locked the box, and headed to the exit. As I walked through the dark hallway, I kept looking over my shoulder. My chest felt squeezed, and I heard my own footsteps echo. I left the library, got in my car, and drove home. That night, I kept replaying the tapes in my head. I couldn't block them out. My scalp felt tight with tension, and I couldn't sit still in my living room. I felt like the tapes had invaded my mind. I looked around my apartment, noticing every detail: the worn carpet, the flickering light in the kitchen, the faded paint on the window frame. I tried to ground myself in something concrete. I reminded myself, I'm here, in the present. But the parallels kept creeping into my thoughts. Every time I tried to sleep, I heard the therapist's voice. I saw the old cassette deck. My chest felt hollow. The next morning, I decided I had to stop. I gathered the box of tapes from my office and locked them in a storage room in the basement. I made sure nobody else would stumble on them. Then I told my boss I needed time off. I didn't give him details. My hands shook as I spoke to him, but I kept it short. He nodded and approved my request. I walked out of the library and got into my car. I sat behind the wheel, feeling both relief and a knot of fear in my stomach. I kept thinking, those tapes exist and they hold pieces of my life, but they're from the 70s. How is that possible? I didn't have an answer. Now I'm at home trying not to think about them. My hands still tremble when I recall Jacob's voice. My chest tightens when I remember Linda's elevator story. I have no idea how or why they match my experiences. I'm too unsettled to look further. I'm not sure what I'll do next. Part of me wants to go back and destroy them. Part of me wants to listen again to find an explanation. But for now, I'm just sitting here staring at my blank wall, listening to the quiet hum of the fridge in the other room, and trying to breathe in and out without feeling that prickling sense of dread. I wish I had never found those tapes. I'm going to be honest. I had zero intention of stopping there. The place looked like a ghost town from half a mile away. Boarded up windows, sagging rooftops, rusted cars on the side of the road. The maps on my phone said nobody lived in that town anymore, and I believed it. Still, I'd been driving for hours. I needed a break. Something in the back of my head told me it was a bad idea, but I pulled off the highway anyway. It was getting late, and I was tired. I thought I'd just stretch my legs, maybe find a spot to rest and get back on the road first thing in the morning. That didn't happen. I drove down the main street, which had a cracked asphalt surface with weeds pushing through. Most buildings had shattered windows or plywood nailed across. The gas station at the corner looked completely gutted. No pumps, no sign, just a battered canopy. I saw an old sign that said "Welcome," missing half its letters. I almost laughed at how bleak it looked. The sun was setting and the light hit everything at an odd angle, making shadows stretch across the ground. There was a feeling of emptiness around me, like the place was stuck in time. I parked my car in front of what might have been a diner. The windows were grimy and the door hung off a hinge. I got out of my car and stretched. The air smelled stale, like dust and old wood. My shoulders were stiff from driving too long. I didn't see any sign of people, so I checked my phone. It still said the area was abandoned. I didn't have much signal, but enough to see that the nearest motel was an hour away. I thought about leaving. I really should have, but I wanted to look around for a minute. There's a kind of odd curiosity that comes with seeing a place like this. You start wondering why everyone left. What happened? Sometimes you just want to find a clue about the past. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the sky turned a dull red. I walked around the block, passing crumbling storefronts, old signs on the ground, and piles of broken bricks. Everything was silent except for a light breeze that kicked up dust. I checked one building, pushing the door open. Inside, there was an empty space with a few overturned chairs and tables. It looked like it had been a small town office or maybe a shop. There wasn't much to see. I stepped back outside, feeling a chill as the temperature dropped. I remember the first strange moment came when I noticed a faint glow from a window across the street. It was soft, kind of like a lamp in another room, but I couldn't see the source. My heart thumped a little faster. The map had told me nobody lived there. I walked closer to get a better look. The window was too dirty for me to see inside. I leaned in, pressed my face against the glass, and tried to shield my eyes from the remaining sunlight. I saw a shape move. It was just a shadow, a silhouette. It passed by quickly, but it was definitely human-sized. I immediately knocked on the door. It rattled but didn't open. I waited, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. No one answered. I tried the handle. Locked. I walked around to the side alley, stepping over random debris. No door there, just boarded up windows. That's when I noticed more lights turning on in other houses further down the street. It wasn't bright like city lights, just a dim glow that barely showed behind curtains or boarded windows. It looked like an entire neighborhood coming to life after dark, but I didn't hear any voices or see anyone outside. I felt uneasy. My gut told me to get back in my car and leave, but my curiosity started to take over. I wanted an explanation. Maybe squatters lived there. Maybe there was a small community the internet didn't know about. My mind ran through all kinds of possibilities, but none felt right. It didn't look like people trying to keep warm with flashlights or lanterns. It looked more organized, like each house had its own faint light. I decided to keep exploring. I walked down the main road, passing houses with peeling paint and broken fences. The sun was gone now, and I needed my flashlight to see where I was stepping. Every few seconds, I'd check a window. Sometimes I'd see a flicker of movement inside. Sometimes I'd just see a faint glow. My mouth went dry, and my palms got sweaty. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting someone to jump out. Nothing happened. When I got close to a small, two-story house, I heard something like footsteps inside. It was a slow, rhythmic sound. I pressed my ear against the front door, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped. I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. I walked around the side, careful not to make noise. There was a window that wasn't fully boarded. I stood on my toes and peeked in. A figure moved across the room. I could only see it in profile. It looked like a man wearing an old jacket, but the details were tough to make out in the dim light. He seemed to be pacing. Then he disappeared into another room. I tried to see where he went, but the angle was bad. I swallowed hard, feeling my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I decided to knock on the side of the house. I rapped on the wood with my knuckles. "Hello?" I said in a low voice. No response. I felt a wave of panic surge through me. Every instinct said to leave, but I took a step back to reevaluate. I told myself, maybe they just didn't want to talk. Maybe they were scared of strangers. But why would they hide in a place the whole world thought was abandoned? I took a deep breath and moved on. My mind was racing, but I tried to stay calm and gather as many details as I could. As I walked further, I noticed my legs shaking a bit. The dust under my boots kept crunching, and every time I heard that sound, I got more jumpy. I kept glancing to my left and right, feeling watched. Lights were glowing behind windows all along the block now. It gave me this suffocating feeling, like I'd stepped into another version of reality where everything looked the same but felt wrong. My stomach tightened, and my throat felt scratchy. My mind jumped to the thought, who are these people? Are they even people? I tried to open a few more doors. Most were locked or jammed. I found one that opened into a hallway full of overturned furniture. I stepped inside, shining my flashlight around. The floor creaked under me, and I caught a whiff of mildew. The wallpaper was peeling, and the ceiling had water damage. I could hear a faint hum from somewhere deeper in the house, like an electrical buzz. I followed the sound until I reached a small living room area. In the corner, there was a dusty TV on a stand. The screen glowed faintly, but there was nothing on it, just static. The hum was coming from that TV, like it was on but not getting a signal. My skin prickled at the sight of it. I walked up and pressed the power button. The screen went dark and the hum disappeared. I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath. Who turned that on? And why? I felt like I was trespassing in someone's home, so I decided to get out of there. I turned to leave, but then I heard a scraping sound from the second floor. It was soft but deliberate. I froze, my flashlight shaking in my grip. I called out, "Is someone here?" No answer. I took a step toward the stairs, but something in me screamed not to go up. My arms felt heavy. My heart thumped hard enough to make my chest hurt. I forced myself to turn around and walk away. I left the house, pulling the door shut behind me. Back on the street, the lights in the neighboring houses seemed brighter, like they were reacting to my presence. Each window had a glow, and each glow felt like a pair of eyes on me. I wiped sweat from my forehead, and my hand came away damp. I decided to return to my car and drive off. But when I got near the diner where I'd parked, I noticed more lights had turned on inside that diner as well. I pressed my face to the glass door. The interior was a mess of broken booths, but a single overhead light flickered in the kitchen. I could hear it buzzing. I stepped inside carefully, my boots crunching on scattered debris. The smell was old cooking oil and mold. I passed by the counter, noticing a half-rotted menu lying on the floor. The letters were faded, and the pictures of food looked decades old. Behind the counter was a small hallway that led to the kitchen. The flicker was coming from there. I moved slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The floor was sticky with who knows what. I reached the kitchen doorway and saw the overhead fluorescent bulb flickering on and off. The entire kitchen was empty, except for a few old appliances. At first I relaxed a bit, thinking there was nothing there. Then I spotted a shape in the corner. It was a person crouched by the sink. Their clothes were dark, maybe just dusty. I couldn't see the face clearly, but I could hear soft breathing. I tensed up, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. "Hello?" I managed to say. The figure jerked upright and ran toward the back door in a sudden rush. I jumped back, my heart slamming in my chest. The person forced the back door open and disappeared outside. I just stood there trying to catch my breath. That was the first time I'd definitely seen someone up close, and they looked real. No weird distortions, no ghostly outlines. It was a living, breathing person. But they didn't speak or show their face. I left the diner and scanned the alley behind it. Nothing. I felt alone again. The fear in my stomach twisted tighter. I started to wonder if maybe I was in real danger. If someone wanted to harm me, it would be easy out there. There were too many corners, too many shadows. The streets felt hostile. The houses loomed over me like silent watchers. My eyes were getting tired, but I kept checking every window, every door, for signs of movement. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to leave. I walked briskly to my car, trying not to break into a run. My hand shook as I reached for the door handle. That's when I noticed footprints in the dust near the driver's side door. They weren't mine. They were smaller, maybe from someone wearing sneakers. They led around the car, then disappeared. My ears pounded with my pulse. I yanked my car door open and jumped in. I locked the doors, started the engine, and looked around. The street was still empty except for the glow from the windows. I put the car in reverse and pulled away from the curb. As I drove through the main street, every house I passed had that faint light. I caught glimpses of shadows through windows, some passing by quickly, some standing still. I didn't roll down my window. I didn't slow down. I just wanted out. The entire time, my brain kept cycling through questions. Who lived there? Why hide? Why not say anything? Once I reached the edge of town, the lights started fading in my rearview mirror. I felt a sense of relief. My body still shook with adrenaline. When I hit the highway, I let out a long sigh and realized how tense my muscles were. My phone lit up with better reception. I tried searching for more information about that town, but all I found were the same notes that it had been abandoned decades ago. No mention of squatters, no mention of restoration efforts. I ended up driving another hour to a roadside motel, where I checked in. My hands were unsteady as I filled out the form. The guy at the front desk asked if I was okay. I just nodded. In my room, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that silent figure in the diner's kitchen or the silhouettes crossing behind grimy windows. I felt an urge to turn around and go back, but my fear kept me in place. I stayed up all night scrolling through any obscure forum or article I could find. Everything said the same thing. The town was abandoned due to economic collapse or some environmental hazard. The official record stopped decades ago. No updates, No reports of anyone moving back. Yet I saw those lights, and I heard those footsteps. I even came face to face with that person in the diner. I knew I wasn't imagining it. That's why it's been on my mind non-stop. I can't accept not knowing. My skin crawls when I think about that place lighting up at night with all those silent people. I don't know if they're survivors, squatters, or something else. But I can't shake the feeling they were aware of me, tracking my movements, watching me pass by, waiting for me to leave. It's got me on edge. Sometimes I hear that buzzing sound from the TV in my dreams. Sometimes I wake up in a sweat, sure that someone is standing outside my window. I can't let it go. I've already started planning another trip out there. I need to figure out what's happening. Every bone in my body says it's a mistake, but every thought in my head screams that I can't rest until I get answers. Next time, I'll bring more supplies. I'll bring better lighting. I might try to find a way into those houses without causing a scene. I want to see them up close and maybe talk to whoever's inside. If there's a whole community living in secret, I need to understand why. And if it's something else, something I can't explain with normal logic, then I need to witness it firsthand. I know it sounds crazy. I know it's not safe. But that place got under my skin. It's all I think about now. I can't move on with my life until I solve this. I keep remembering how the lights turned on one by one, as if they were responding to the darkness or my presence. I remember how the silhouettes moved, slow and deliberate, always just out of sight. I remember how that person in the diner bolted away before I could say anything else. There was no fear in their posture, more like annoyance that I'd caught them off guard. That's the image that sticks with me. Someone crouching in a corner, waiting for me to pass. I'm not sure what I'll do if I actually meet them face to face and they decide they don't want me around, but I can't keep wondering. I'd rather face the truth, even if it's bizarre, than keep picturing those glowing windows and unanswered questions. The only way to find out what's really going on is to go back, and that's exactly what I plan to do. I'll never forget that night. It was supposed to be a simple final check in an old deserted subway station, the kind of job nobody wants to do, but someone has to. The place had been closed off for years, and most of the staff stayed clear of it unless they were assigned a routine inspection. I'd done this kind of round before, though never in a station that felt so isolated. I'd heard stories from coworkers about strange noises or flickering lights, but I always figured people see what they want to see in the dark. I'm pretty level-headed, and I like to get my job done without any fuss. But that night, I discovered that some stations hold more than just echoes and dust. I arrived at the entrance around midnight. The security gate was down, and I used a special key to let myself in. My supervisor had told me, just do a quick sweep. Make sure there's no broken glass, no graffiti, no sign of squatters. He said it like it was no big deal. I remember the faint hum of the overhead lights in the corridor just before the main stairs. The electricity was still running there for some reason, though the rest of the station was mostly dark. I flicked on my flashlight and stepped onto the first step. It creaked a little, and I noticed my own footsteps echoing in the concrete space. Everything seemed normal, just a bunch of stale air and grime. As I descended, the corridor opened up into the main platform area. It smelled damp, like water had seeped through the cracks. The floor was made of old tiles, chipped in some places, and the walls were covered in those dull white ceramic squares that reflect a bit of light. My flashlight beam moved across the floor, then up along the walls. I glanced around and saw the usual stuff. A few torn posters, a broken vending machine in a corner, and some scattered trash that was probably older than me. The place felt dead, but not in a peaceful way. More like an unease that hangs in the air. I heard a distant drip of water, and it echoed so much it sounded like someone tapping. I shined my flashlight around, trying to locate the source of the dripping. Then I saw a faint glimmer on the wall. It was just my own reflection in one of the tiles, but something about it made me pause. I noticed it wasn't a single tile reflecting me. It was like a patch of tiles showing a partial reflection, almost like a distorted mirror. I shifted my flashlight slightly and my reflection moved. I tilted my head and it did the same. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just a weird angle. I kept walking. My footsteps scraped against dirt on the ground, and I stopped every now and then to check for cracks in the floor. My job was to note any structural damage or hazards. The station had been out of service for years, so I half expected to find some major problems. But other than the obvious neglect, it all seemed stable enough. I jotted down a few notes on a clipboard. Broken tile near stairway, graffiti in the second corridor, water leakage near the far end of the platform. It was straightforward stuff. Every so often I'd look up and catch my reflection again. But then I started noticing something odd. Sometimes it looked like there was more than one reflection. I'd see a shape that might have been a shoulder or a head in the corner of my eye, always on the tile. But when I'd turn my flashlight directly at it, I'd see nothing but the empty corridor or platform. I told myself I was just tired. Late shifts can do that to a person, especially in a gloomy place like that. My stomach felt a little queasy, and I tried to steady my breathing. I made my way toward the far end of the platform. The old tracks were still there, rusted and full of debris. I shined my flashlight down the tunnel, but all I could see was darkness and a few scattered bits of rubble. The air was heavy and thick, and it smelled like damp metal. I checked my watch. 12:20 a.m. I planned to be out of there by 1 wide at the latest. There was no reason to stick around any longer than necessary. As I started back along the platform, I heard a faint scrape. It was like a shoe brushing against the floor. My heart jumped, and I froze for a second. I listened, but the noise didn't repeat. I told myself it was probably a rat or a piece of debris shifting. Still, I felt my pulse speed up. I did a quick 360 with my flashlight. Nothing. Just the same old abandoned station covered in dust and darkness. I kept moving, but now I was on edge. I heard my own breath, short and uneven. My palms felt sweaty, and I wiped one against my pant leg. I scanned the walls as I walked. I saw the same reflections as before, except now I was sure I caught the outline of what looked like a person. It was just for an instant, there on the tile, as though someone was standing on the other side of the station. But when I swung my flashlight to that exact spot, there was nothing. I forced a laugh, but it came out shaky. I reached the station's waiting area. The benches were old wood, and some were broken. A few old newspapers lay scattered, their pages yellow and brittle. I stepped closer to one and read the headline, something about a mayor's election from years ago. Nothing important. I turned around, and my flashlight landed on the wall. That's when I saw a clearer reflection, like a silhouette of a head and shoulders. It was on the tiles, but I was standing too far away for it to be me. It was just there, like someone was standing behind me. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my throat. I spun around, aiming my flashlight behind me. Empty. Then I turned back to the wall. The silhouette was gone. I felt my legs start to shake a little. I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe the reflection was some trick of the light or a piece of debris on the tile surface. Still, I wanted to finish quickly. My notes were almost complete. I just needed to double-check the stairwell on the other side. I headed toward that stairwell, trying not to think about the shapes I kept seeing. Each step felt heavier than the last. I turned down a narrow corridor that connected one platform to another. The overhead lights here were either off or completely dead, so my flashlight was the only source of illumination. The tile walls in this corridor were grimy, and I could see mold growing in the corners. About halfway through the corridor, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. I stopped. My chest got tight, and I directed my flashlight onto the wall. I saw a reflection that looked exactly like a person's profile. It had a defined chin, nose, and I could make out the curve of a shoulder. I stood there, breathing hard. The reflection shifted slightly as though it was looking right at me. I swallowed. My mouth felt dry as sand. I stepped forward, and the reflection seemed to step forward too, but it was on the wall, moving in sync with me. I lifted my arm and saw the shape lift an arm as well. My pulse was racing, and I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. I thought, this is insane. There's no one here. This can't be real. I waved my flashlight across the wall, and for a second the reflection flickered. Then it settled back into the same shape, but now it wasn't quite matching my movements. I hurried down the corridor, refusing to look at the walls. My boots clicked on the tile floor and my breath echoed. When I finally reached the next set of stairs, I stopped to catch my breath. My heart thudded in my ears. I forced myself to look at the wall again, just to prove to myself there was nothing there. This time all I saw was my own reflection. I exhaled, trying to slow my pulse. I climbed the stairs. At the top, there was a small entrance to a side platform that had been closed off for even longer than the main area. The signage was faded, and the gate that led to the street was locked. I checked the chain, tugging on it to confirm it was still secure. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. They were faint but unmistakable, soft thuds on the tile. I whipped around, shining my flashlight. Empty, but I could still hear the echoes of those steps in my head. I decided I'd had enough. I'd noted all the issues. I didn't care about checking every single corner anymore. I just wanted out. I turned to head back, but now the corridor seemed darker than before. My flashlight felt weaker, or maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. I walked quickly, trying not to slip on the damp floor. As I moved, I heard more footstep sounds. They seemed to come from behind me and then from the side. It was like there were multiple people in there, all walking at the same pace. I kept whipping my head around, aiming my flashlight, but I saw nothing in the darkness. My heart hammered in my chest. My mouth felt stale, and my hands were shaking so badly that the flashlight beam trembled across the walls. Then I saw them. Or at least I saw their reflections. There were several shapes on the tiles, all shaped like people. They weren't transparent or ghostly. They looked like black silhouettes. They moved in the glossy surface as if they were stepping closer to me. Each time I took a step back, the reflections seemed to advance. My chest got tight, and I felt my face grow hot. I backed away, aiming my flashlight at the floor to avoid looking at those shapes. But they were on the floor too, on the wet spots where the tiles were shinier. I started half running, half walking, not even sure where I was going. My boots slipped on something, and I had to brace myself against the wall. When I did, I felt the cold tile under my palm, and I swear it felt like something brushed against my hand from the other side of that wall. I yanked my hand back and nearly dropped my flashlight. I forced myself to keep going, my breaths ragged and fast. The station began to feel like a maze. The corridors and stairwells all looked the same. I knew I had come from the main platform side, but every direction seemed equally dark. My flashlight's beam flickered once, and I panicked, thinking the batteries were dying. I shook it a little, and the light steadied. The reflections kept appearing on every nearby surface. Some were closer, some were further away, but they were always there, like I was surrounded. Eventually, I spotted the main stairwell that led up to the entrance gate. I felt a surge of relief. I hurried toward it, trying not to trip on the broken tiles. My breath was coming in shallow gasps, and my legs felt stiff. The echoes of footsteps seemed even louder, like a group of people marching. I forced myself not to look back. When I got to the stairs, I glanced at the wall to my right. There was a big panel of tiles, and I saw maybe 4 or 5 of these silhouettes reflected there. They were spaced out, but all were facing me. My chest felt like it was going to explode. My mind was racing with questions, but I didn't have time to think about answers. I just wanted to leave. I took the stairs 2 at a time, gripping the handrail so hard my knuckles hurt. At the top, I reached the security gate. I fumbled with the key, my hand shaking so much that I dropped it on the floor. I crouched to pick it up, and that's when I saw the reflection in the metal of the gate itself. The silhouettes were at the bottom of the stairs, moving toward me. I heard a faint scraping sound, like dozens of feet shuffling. My hands felt numb, and I could barely control my fingers as I pushed the key into the lock. I turned it, and the gate slid open with a squeal that echoed in the silence. I rushed through and slammed it shut behind me, locking it again. My breath was ragged, and I pressed my forehead against the cool metal for a moment, trying to steady myself. Then I forced myself to look back. The corridor was dark, and my flashlight beam barely reached the top of the stairs. I saw no movement now, no reflections on the walls. It was just darkness. I let out a shaky exhale. My heart was still racing and my clothes felt damp with sweat. I stepped away from the gate, moving toward the exit that led to the surface. The overhead light in that small entrance area was still buzzing, casting a weak glow. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. I moved as fast as I could, each step echoing. Finally, I made it to the street-level door. I shoved it open and felt a rush of cool night air. I inhaled it like it was the first real breath I'd taken all night. Outside, the streetlights were on, and the city looked calm. I stood there for a moment, hunched over, trying to catch my breath. My entire body trembled, and my throat felt tight. I glanced back at the door, half expecting those silhouettes to appear in the glass, but nothing was there. I didn't see a single shape following me. I walked to my truck, got in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so bad that I couldn't get the key in the ignition at first. When the engine finally started, I sat there with the headlights off, staring at the station entrance. It looked normal from the outside, just a locked door with a warning sign about unauthorized access. A few minutes passed before I felt calm enough to drive away. My shirt was clinging to my back with sweat, and I kept feeling like someone was in the passenger seat watching me. But I was alone. When I got back to the depot, I handed my supervisor the clipboard without a word. He looked at me funny, probably because I was still shaky and pale. He started to ask something, but I mumbled something about not feeling well and headed out. I spent the rest of the night trying to process what happened. I couldn't figure it out. Part of me wanted to believe it was just my nerves, the flicker of my flashlight, and some random illusions caused by reflective tiles. But it felt too real. The shapes moved in ways I couldn't explain. I heard footsteps that shouldn't have been there. I never asked for another shift at that station. In fact, I made a point to avoid it. I told my supervisor I'd handle any other job, but not that one. I didn't care if it cost me a bit of overtime, or if I lost some points with the higher-ups. I wasn't going back. I still wonder what I saw that night. I know that place is abandoned, and no one has been stationed there for a long time. Yet I saw reflections that didn't match my body. I heard footsteps and felt the presence of multiple figures in the darkness. I don't talk about it much because I don't have any fancy explanation. All I know is that I wasn't alone in that station, even though nobody else was physically there. And that's enough for me to stay away. I can still picture those silhouettes whenever I close my eyes. The way they seemed to converge toward me like they had a purpose. The memory makes my chest tighten, and I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, expecting to see them in the corners of my bedroom. But they're not there. I only ever saw them in that station, on those grimy white tiles. That's the story. It's direct, and it's all I have. I was just a regular subway worker doing my job, but something else was in that station with me. They never touched me or spoke to me, and I didn't see anyone die or anything like that. But I felt cornered, and I felt terrified in a way I've never been before. I can't explain it, and I'm not going back to figure it out. If someone else wants to do the inspection next time, they can. I'm done. I still remember the first night I heard the phone ring. It was a little before midnight, and I was at the front desk of the old commercial building where I work. My name is Marcus. I'm a doorman on the night shift, and I've been here for years. Usually, nothing happens after 9 p.m. Most offices close around 6 m, and a few cleaning crews stick around until maybe 8 cows. Then it's just me and a couple of security cameras. By midnight, even the lights in the hallways go dim to save energy. The place feels empty and quiet, and I've grown used to that. But that night, something changed. I was sitting in the lobby, leaning back in the old swivel chair behind the reception desk. The small TV in front of me was muted, showing some late-night show I wasn't really watching. I had one earbud in, listening to some talk radio, trying to stay awake. Right then, the old intercom phone on the desk rang. The noise made me jump. It wasn't a normal ring. It made a dull, buzzing sound. I glanced at the clock on the wall. Exactly midnight. I picked up the receiver and said, "Lobby." My voice came out shaky because that phone rarely rings after 10 RPM, let alone right at midnight. There was a pause, maybe 3 or 4 seconds, and then a man's voice said, "I need to deliver something to you. It's yours. You lost it a long time ago." I felt a chill run through my arms. His tone was flat and calm, like he was sure I knew what he meant, but I didn't. I had no idea what he was talking about. I tried to clear my throat. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Who is this? Which floor are you on?" Another pause. Then he said, "Come up. I'm on your floor." And then he hung up. I stood there holding the phone against my ear. I heard static and then the dial tone. I looked at the phone's little display. It said the call came from the 13th floor, but this building only has 12 floors. I stared at the screen, confused, and then I put the phone down. My heart was pounding, and my mouth felt dry. I glanced around the lobby. The lights near the entrance were still on, and I could see my reflection in the glass doors. My uniform looked a bit wrinkled, and I noticed a bead of sweat on my forehead. Usually, the building is so quiet at this hour that I can hear the hum of the ceiling fans. That night, I heard a faint ringing in my ears, like my body was reacting to something I couldn't explain. I stepped out from behind the desk and walked toward the elevator banks. I pressed the call button. Nothing unusual happened. The elevator arrived, doors slid open, and I stepped inside. The overhead light was flickering a bit. That sometimes happens because the building is old. I looked at the panel of buttons. They were labeled from 1 to 12, plus a basement level. There was no 13, which didn't surprise me. Most older buildings skip that number. I pressed 12. The elevator felt slow as it went up. The building is tall enough that I usually sense a shift in my stomach around the 6th floor, but this time I just felt tense. When the doors opened, I stepped out into the 12th floor hallway. The lights were dim, and the corridor was empty. The offices on this floor are for a small insurance company, but they close early. The doors were all locked, and the place smelled like stale air. I checked the entire floor, trying each door handle. All locked. No lights on in the offices. No one there. I got back into the elevator. I thought about trying the basement. Maybe someone was messing around with the phone lines there. So I pressed B, and the elevator went down. When I arrived, I looked around the storage areas. I saw a few empty boxes and old cleaning supplies, but nothing else. The phone on the wall there was covered in dust. It didn't look like it had been used in years. I ran my fingers over it, then picked it up and listened. Just a normal dial tone. I set it back and went upstairs to the lobby again. The rest of my shift was quiet, but I couldn't shake that uneasy feeling. The next night, things were normal until midnight. Then the same phone on the reception desk buzzed again. I looked at the display. 13 flickered on the screen. My heart started beating faster. I picked up the receiver and said, "Hello?" The same voice answered, sounding calm and direct. "Marcus, come up. I have something for you." "You lost it?" I asked. "What did I lose?" He stayed silent for a few seconds, then he said, "You'll see. Come to my floor." I almost yelled into the phone, "There is no 13th floor." Then the call ended. This time I didn't try to investigate. I just stayed at the desk. My palms felt sweaty. I tapped my foot against the tile floor, trying to shake off the nerves. Every now and then I looked up toward the elevator, but nothing happened. I checked the security cameras. The feed showed empty hallways on all 12 floors, plus the basement. No movement. I felt something like a knot in my stomach. I wanted to go home, but my shift wasn't over. So I just sat there, waiting. By 6 a.m., everything was normal again, and the first employees began to arrive. I went home and tried to sleep, but I kept thinking about that voice. Over the next couple of days, I tried talking to the building manager about the phone lines. He just shrugged and said the internal system was old, and sometimes calls got misrouted. I asked if there was ever a 13th floor in the building's history. He said he didn't know. The building was built a long time ago, and the original documentation might be incomplete. He suggested maybe the phone labeling was glitching out. But that didn't explain how the voice knew my name and claimed to have something I lost. I spent my shifts feeling on edge. I checked the phone lines, the cameras, even walked the floors before midnight. Nothing strange happened until exactly 12 a.m. Then the phone would ring and the display would say 13. Always the same voice, always the same request. "Marcus, I have something for you. It's something you lost a long time ago. Come up." I asked who he was, but he never answered. He'd just say, "You know me." Then he'd hang up. One night, after a week of these calls, I decided to go upstairs again, just to get it over with. When the clock in the lobby hit midnight, I waited for the phone to ring. I answered it. The same voice said, "I'm waiting. Elevator's open." I felt my pulse quicken. The line went dead. I set the receiver down and walked to the elevator. Its doors were already open and the interior light was flickering. It shouldn't do that on its own. I stepped inside. The panel still showed floors 1 through 12 and the basement, but as I stood there, I saw a small glow near the space between 12 and 14. There was no 14, obviously, but the number 13 looked faint, as if it was hidden behind the metal. I pressed that spot. At first, nothing happened. Then the elevator doors slid shut. I felt the elevator moving up, but it moved slower than normal. My hands were shaking a bit. I tried to steady my breathing. I watched the floor numbers on the panel. They went 10, 11, 12. Then nothing. The elevator kept moving, but no numbers lit up. I heard the cables groan. Then it stopped with a jolt. The doors opened onto a hallway I had never seen before. The lights were dim, and the walls looked worn, like they hadn't been painted in decades. The floor had old, stained carpet. A faint smell of mold lingered in the air. It felt cold, and I sensed a breeze like a window was open somewhere. But there were no windows in sight. I stepped out carefully, leaving one foot inside the elevator. I looked around. There were 3 doors on this hallway, 2 on the left, 1 on the right. All had chipped paint and old nameplates, but the letters were too faded to read. I heard nothing except my own breathing. My heart was pounding so loud that I could feel my pulse in my ears. I forced myself to take a few steps forward. The elevator doors slid shut behind me, and I spun around, but there was no button on the outside to call it back. My throat felt tight. I approached the first door on the left. It had a grimy doorknob. I tried it, but it was locked. I knocked softly. No answer. Then I moved to the second door on the left. Same thing, locked. The door on the right looked slightly ajar. I heard a faint buzzing sound from inside, like an old fluorescent light about to burn out. My palms were damp as I touched the door and pushed it open. Inside, I saw an empty room with cracked walls and a bare concrete floor. A single overhead light flickered. There was a wooden table in the center, and on it a small metal box. It was maybe 6 inches wide, with a simple latch on the front. I hesitated. I didn't see anyone in the room, but I felt like someone was watching me. The hairs on my arms stood up. I approached the table, my breath felt shallow. I reached out, unlatched the box, and opened it. Inside, I saw a ring. It was a plain silver band, a bit tarnished. I recognized it right away. It was the ring my ex-wife gave me when we were still married. I lost it years ago. I looked at it closely, noticing a small scratch on the inside. I remembered the day I dropped it in a parking lot and never found it again. Yet, here it was. I felt my stomach twist. I grabbed the ring and held it in my hand. It felt cold. I looked around, hoping to see someone, but the room was empty. Then I heard a phone ring from behind me. I turned around and saw an old desk phone on the floor in the corner. I hadn't noticed it when I walked in. It was black with a rotary dial covered in dust. It rang again, and I felt a jolt of adrenaline shoot through my chest. I walked over and picked it up. Before I could say anything, I heard the same man's voice. "That's yours. Don't lose it again." I cleared my throat and forced myself to speak. "Who are you?" I asked. My voice shook. He just said, "You know me." And then I heard a click. The line went dead. I put the handset back on the cradle and stood there for a moment, heart hammering in my chest. I decided I needed to leave. I walked back to the door, stepped into the hallway and looked for the elevator. I didn't see it. The wall looked empty. I touched the spot where the elevator doors had been, but all I felt was a cold, hard surface. My hands started shaking again. I took a few steps forward, checking the other doors, but they were still locked. Suddenly, I heard the elevator chime behind me. I spun around and saw that the doors were there again. They slid open, revealing the flickering light inside. I rushed in, pressing the button that said lobby. The doors closed and the elevator jerked downward. This ride felt faster. My stomach lurched and I grabbed the handrail. About 10 seconds later, the doors opened to the familiar lobby. I stumbled out. Everything looked normal. The clock on the wall said 12:05 a.m. It felt like I'd been gone longer, but it was only 5 minutes past midnight. I stood there, breathing heavily, holding the ring in my left hand. My shirt was damp with sweat. I looked around and noticed the lobby was empty. The front doors were locked as usual. Outside, the streetlights cast a dull glow on the sidewalk. I walked back to the reception desk, set the ring on the counter, and stared at it. I felt relief, but also confusion. I kept asking myself how this was possible. I didn't come up with any answers. For the rest of the night, I sat there, waiting to see if anything else would happen. The phone didn't ring again. By the time my shift ended, I was drained. My legs felt weak. I went home as soon as the morning doorman arrived. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't stop replaying everything in my head. The next night at work, I waited for the call, but midnight passed, and the phone stayed silent. The same thing happened the night after. It never rang again from that 13th floor. I checked the elevator panel. The hidden button was gone. There was no faint glow this time. It looked perfectly normal. I even pressed on the spot between 12 and the basement button, but nothing happened. Everything looked the way it always did. I keep the ring in my pocket now. I hold it sometimes just to remind myself it's real. The building manager has no explanation. He says the phone system might have had a technical anomaly, but nobody else got calls from that extension. Nobody else saw that floor, and I know I didn't imagine it. It felt too real. I remember the smell of the hallway, the flickering light, the cold metal box, and the tension in my chest. I remember the sound of that man's voice telling me not to lose the ring again. I still work here. I still do the night shift. Every time the phone rings after midnight, I feel my chest tighten, but it's always a tenant who stayed late or someone trying to reach security. No more calls from a non-existent floor. No more strange voices. But sometimes around midnight, I catch myself staring at the elevator. I watch the lights on the panel and wonder if it might move on its own. Part of me wants it to happen again, to get some kind of answer. Another part of me never wants to see that place again. I don't like feeling that rush of cold fear in my spine. I can't explain how that man got my ring or what that floor was. All I know is that I went there, I saw it, and I held something I lost years ago. The memory of that night feels sharp in my mind. There's no comforting explanation, but I do my job the same way I always have. I check the lobby, I answer calls, I make my rounds, and at midnight, I wait. Sometimes the phone stays quiet, and sometimes a regular call comes through from a real floor. But I'll never forget those nights when the call came from the 13th floor, telling me to come up and get back what I lost. I don't expect it to happen again, but I'm always ready just in case, and I'll never let go of that ring again. I feel the weight of the old key in my hand as I stand at the front gate. It's late afternoon and there's a silence around this property that makes the back of my neck tense. I inherited this place from a relative I never met. I only got a short letter in the mail telling me I was the last living person in our line who could take possession. I didn't feel excited at first. It felt more like an inconvenience. But then I arrived and saw the house up close. Its chipped paint and bowed porch boards told me it was old, but it didn't look like it was about to collapse. It had a strong frame, tall windows, and a large front door with a tarnished handle. Something about it felt important, like it was waiting for me. I stepped onto the porch, unlocked the door, and walked inside. The smell of dust and stale air hit me first. I coughed a few times and looked around. The front room had a worn-out couch, a small wooden table, and some scattered chairs. I set my bag on the table and walked through the house, flipping on light switches. Most of them worked, but the dim bulbs did little to brighten the space. Wood floors creaked under my feet. Every time I opened a door, I expected something to jump out at me. Nothing did, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my stomach. I moved from room to room, checking the condition of each one. The kitchen had an ancient refrigerator and a stove from maybe the 1950s. I tested the faucet and water sputtered out in bursts before finally flowing in a steady stream. It didn't smell bad, so I figured the well system still worked somehow. I opened a small closet near the back door and found a few old coats on wooden hangers. One coat had a broken zipper, and the other had a large tear at the shoulder. I felt like these items had been waiting in the dark for years. I found the bedroom on the first floor. It had a large bed, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and a dusty rug. I tapped my foot on the rug and saw the dust rise in a cloud. As I lifted the rug to shake it out, I noticed a heavy trapdoor in the floor. It looked sturdy, with large iron hinges and a thick handle. My heart thumped a little harder. I pulled on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I tried again, using both hands and putting my weight into it. Nothing. I crouched down and saw a heavy padlock attached to a loop on the side of the trapdoor. It was an old padlock, rusted, but it looked solid. That was the first time I felt a chill. The air in the room seemed to drop a few degrees, and I sensed a pressure in my chest. I stood back up, took a few deep breaths, and tried to shake off the feeling. But I kept looking at that trapdoor. I knew it led to a basement or a cellar. It had to. For some reason, it felt different than just an ordinary locked door. I decided to explore the rest of the house before coming back to the trapdoor. Upstairs, I found 3 more rooms. One was empty except for a single wooden chair in the corner. Another was packed with boxes of old books, newspapers, and magazines. The third had an iron bed frame and a small dresser. None of the rooms had that same strange aura as the bedroom with the trapdoor. Still, my mind kept drifting back to it. As the sun started to go down, I realized I hadn't eaten all day. I dug through my bag and found a couple of protein bars. I walked around to the back porch and stepped outside to get some fresh air. The porch overlooked a small field with tall grass, and beyond that, a line of trees. Everything was quiet. I heard no birds, no rustling in the grass. The quiet felt unnatural. I swallowed my food without tasting much. My mind was stuck on that locked door. I went back inside and set up a small cot in the living room near a window. The bedroom with the trapdoor made me uneasy, and I didn't want to sleep on that big dusty bed anyway. The living room felt neutral, less charged. I turned off most of the lights but kept a small lamp on near the couch. I lay down exhausted, but my eyes wouldn't stay shut. About an hour later, I heard a faint scratching sound. It was soft at first, like something brushing against wood. I sat up, heart pounding, trying to pinpoint the noise. It sounded like it came from underneath the floor. Every little hair on my arm stood up. I got up and walked toward the bedroom with the trapdoor, but the scratching stopped. I stood there in the hallway listening, but there was only silence. My heart was racing and my stomach felt tight. I took a step closer to the bedroom door, and the doorknob felt cold in my hand. I slowly pushed the door open. The lamp in the living room cast some light so I could see most of the floor. The trapdoor looked exactly the same, locked and silent. I waited, holding my breath, but there was no more scratching. I stayed there for a minute or two, trying to decide whether to force the lock. Eventually, I decided to leave it for the morning. I wasn't ready to deal with it in the dark. Returning to the couch, I tried to sleep again. This time I left my shoes on in case I needed to jump up fast. My mind kept picturing the trapdoor. I felt a twist in my stomach whenever I imagined opening it. Eventually, I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke up multiple times from vague nightmares I couldn't remember. Each time the house was silent, but it felt like it was breathing around me. When morning light came through the window, my eyes were gritty and my head ached. I stretched, rubbed my face, and decided to find something to eat in town. I grabbed my keys, locked up, and drove down the dirt road until I found a small diner. The bacon and eggs tasted greasy, but the coffee helped clear my head. I picked up a few groceries and some tools from the hardware store. I got a heavy-duty bolt cutter, figuring I might need it for that lock. My chest felt tight just thinking about it, but I had to open that door. The curiosity was too strong. Back at the house, I walked straight to the bedroom. My footsteps echoed in the hallway. I knelt down by the trap door and inspected the padlock more closely. It was thick and rusted, but I could still make out some brand name that I didn't recognize. I took a deep breath and positioned the bolt cutter around the lock. My arms shook a bit as I applied pressure. The lock didn't break on the first try. I repositioned, gritted my teeth, and squeezed harder. The lock snapped with a sharp crack, and I almost lost my balance. As soon as the lock broke, I felt a sudden rush of cold air like someone had opened a window. But the windows were all closed. My chest got that same pressure again, and I exhaled hard to calm myself. I set the broken padlock aside and lifted the trap door. It was heavier than I expected. The hinges squeaked, and dust fell into the dark opening below. A musty smell drifted up, not quite like mold, more like old earth and stale air. I shone a flashlight down. A wooden staircase led into darkness. The steps looked worn but not rotten. I took one careful step down, then another, keeping the flashlight aimed ahead of me. The walls were damp to the touch, and the air was thick. My heart was thudding so hard I could feel it in my ears. When I reached the bottom, I found a small room, maybe 10 by 10 feet with a low ceiling. The walls were rough stone. There was a single table against one wall and some shelves with jars. The jars were covered in dust and I couldn't see what was inside without wiping them off. I inched closer and wiped a jar with my sleeve. It looked like dried herbs or leaves. Another jar had a liquid that had turned dark over time. A shiver ran through my spine and the hair on my arm stood up again. Near the table I saw a wooden box. It had iron corners and a latch. The lid was carved with some kind of symbol, like 3 circles overlapping. It wasn't a symbol I recognized. My hands felt sweaty as I touched the latch. It wasn't locked. I lifted the lid and looked inside. There were some old letters and a small metal object wrapped in cloth. I unwrapped it and found what looked like a small bell with strange markings. I felt a chill holding it like it was unnaturally cold. Then I heard a loud thump from above like a door slamming. I froze, eyes fixed on the staircase. My heart was pounding in my throat. I half expected someone to come rushing down, but there was only silence. I took the letters and the metal bell, placed them in my jacket pocket, and headed back up. I could feel my legs trembling on the steps. When I got up to the bedroom, I stood still for a moment listening. The house was quiet again, but it felt heavier. I propped the trapdoor open with a chair so it wouldn't slam shut. Then I walked into the living room. The front door was closed, but the wind outside had kicked up a bit. I told myself that must have caused the noise. I wasn't sure I believed it. My chest felt tight again, and my palms were damp. I sat on the couch, took out the letters, and flipped through them. They were written in an old-fashioned style, and I could barely read some of the handwriting. I caught a few phrases. Keep it sealed. The door must remain locked, and do not let anyone open it. I felt my stomach twist. Whoever wrote these letters seemed convinced there was something dangerous below. My throat felt dry, and my eyes started to ache from straining at the messy text. The letters didn't mention what was in the basement, just warnings. Lots of warnings. I took out the small bell again. I held it in my hand and turned it over. There were tiny etchings on the sides, shapes that reminded me of some old script I'd seen in antique stores. I gave it a gentle shake. It made a muted, dull sound, not like a normal bell. It almost sounded like metal on metal, but softer. It gave me goosebumps. I felt sure it was connected to the locked basement in some way. Over the next few hours, I tried to focus on cleaning up the house. I swept floors, opened some windows to let in fresh air, and wiped off surfaces. But my mind kept returning to the basement and the items I found. Each time I thought about them, my stomach got that uneasy twist. I kept hearing faint noises like scratching or tapping under the floor, but every time I paused and listened carefully, it would stop. That night, I decided to sleep in the same spot on the couch. I closed the trap door again and dragged the couch so I could see the bedroom door from where I lay. I wasn't sure what I expected to happen, but I wanted to be ready. I stayed awake a long time, my heart racing every time I heard a noise, even if it was just the wind. Eventually, I drifted off. Sometime later, I shot awake. A loud thud echoed from the bedroom. My pulse skyrocketed and I jumped to my feet. The living room lamp was still on. The clock on the wall showed it was a little after 2 in the morning. My mouth felt dry as I crept down the hall, flashlight in hand, to the bedroom door. I paused, listening. I heard scraping, like something hard dragging across the wooden floor. I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The trapdoor was open. I was sure I had closed it before lying down. Now it was raised just enough for me to see the black gap underneath. My chest felt like someone was pressing on it with both hands. I stepped into the room, aiming my flashlight at the trapdoor. The beam showed the first few steps going down. I couldn't see anything else. I stood there, breathing fast, my skin damp with sweat. The scraping noise had stopped. Everything was still. Then the trapdoor slammed shut on its own, causing me to jump back and almost drop my flashlight. The force of it made dust float up from the floor. I backed out of the room, breathing hard, and shut the bedroom door. My mind was racing. I felt like I was going to pass out. I pulled myself together enough to move a chair to block the bedroom door. Then I paced around the living room, trying to make sense of this. My arms were shaking, and my shirt was soaked with sweat. I wanted to leave the house, but something kept me there. I couldn't just drive away and pretend this wasn't happening. For the rest of the night, I sat on the couch, shining my flashlight at the hallway. I didn't hear any more noises. The air felt thick and cold, but I forced myself to breathe slowly. By the time dawn came, my head was pounding, and I was dehydrated. I kept thinking about the letters and the warnings. It was clear that whatever was locked down there had been sealed away for a reason. When the sun finally rose, I got up, moved the chair away from the bedroom door, and peeked inside. The trap door was closed. I entered carefully, half expecting something to jump out. The door on the floor was still shut tight. I didn't try to open it again. Instead, I grabbed my bag, stuffed the letters and the bell inside, and walked out of that bedroom. My heart was racing, and I just wanted to get away from that padlock and the cold air that seemed to linger around it. I made my way to the front door and stepped outside. The early morning light felt like a relief. I inhaled the cool air, tasting the hint of dew on the wind. I locked the front door behind me out of habit, but I knew that wouldn't stop anything. I stood on the porch, my hands in my pockets, feeling the weight of the strange bell pressing against my thigh. I didn't know if I should call someone or just leave for good. My chest still hurt and my stomach churned. I couldn't ignore the tension I felt in my body. Even out here, away from the trapdoor, I felt like something was watching me from behind the walls. I looked back at the house, noticing how the windows almost looked like dark eyes. The place was mine now, whether I wanted it or not. But I knew I couldn't stay in that house alone again. Not after what I'd seen and heard. I decided to step down off the porch and walk around the property for a bit to clear my head. I ended up pacing around the field behind the house, focusing on the crunch of gravel under my boots and the rustle of the tall grass against my jeans. Every time I glanced back at the house, I felt a tightness in my chest. My mind was stuck on the basement. I kept recalling the scraping noises, the cold rush of air, and that door slamming shut. I wanted to forget it, but I knew I couldn't. Something was in there and it wanted out. I finally headed to my truck, climbed in, and sat behind the wheel for a long time. My hands were shaking, and I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I wanted to believe that maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe I was just too tired, too stressed. But the broken padlock, the letters in my bag, and the memory of that door slamming wouldn't let me kid myself. I told myself I'd come back later with help. Or maybe I'd call someone who knows about old houses and weird old basements. But for now, I needed to get away. I started the engine and drove off, watching the house grow smaller in my rearview mirror. My heart pounded every time I thought about what might still be under that floor. The tightness in my chest stayed with me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. I was leaving for now, but I knew deep down that I would have to deal with whatever was locked in that basement. I just hoped I could handle it when the time came. I felt a tightness in my chest the moment I stepped out of the car. The air was wet and smelled like old wood and damp leaves. My friend's cabin sat at the very edge of a steep trail, surrounded by towering pines that looked almost black against the late afternoon sky. When I looked at the peak above us, I saw swirling clouds of fog drifting in slow circles. I tried to remind myself I was here to relax, but my stomach churned. I told myself I was just tired from the long drive, but something about that mountain unsettled me. My friend, his name is Rob, walked up and slapped me on the back, telling me to come inside before the fog got thicker. I followed him in without a word. The cabin had a narrow front porch, old planks that creaked under our feet. Inside, the place was cramped. Small living room, tiny kitchen, single bathroom, and 2 bedrooms. Rob said he'd been spending most weekends up here. He insisted the views were worth the trip. He also claimed the isolation helped him clear his mind. I remember looking around at the dusty shelves, the flickering overhead light, and the thick curtains. Everything felt stale. Still, I tried to act casual. We set my bag in the spare bedroom and sat down at a worn-out table to share a quick meal. I noticed the windows looked fogged from the outside, even though it wasn't that cold yet. Rob told me the fog around here can seep into every crack and I shouldn't worry about it. After dinner, I went to my room. I expected a peaceful night, but I couldn't sleep. The wind outside had picked up, and I heard it whipping through the trees. My window was cracked open a little, and I could feel a cold draft on my face. The cabin's walls groaned when the wind blew hard. It was a steady pattern. Creak, pause, groan, pause. I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to slow my breathing. My eyelids started to get heavy around midnight and I drifted off. I don't know how long I slept. I jolted awake to an odd chill on my cheeks. A hazy white fog floated inside the room. I sat up, blinking hard, trying to make sense of it. I could see a shape next to my bed. My heart hammered and my mouth went dry. It looked like a person. They weren't moving. I gasped, and for a second I couldn't do anything but stare. The shape was dark, but I could make out shoulders, a head, and arms. It stayed perfectly still, like someone standing guard. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My hands shook and I felt sweat on my forehead even though the air was freezing. I fumbled for the lamp on the nightstand and flicked it on. In that instant, the shape was gone. The fog still lingered, but I saw nothing else there. I sat on the edge of the bed rubbing my eyes, my heart pounding so hard that I felt it in my temples. I told myself it was a trick of the light or a half dream. Maybe the altitude or humidity or something else caused me to see things. I forced myself to lie back down. I pulled the sheets up to my chin and stared at the dark corners of the room until dawn. At breakfast, I asked Rob if he ever saw anything strange in the cabin at night. He laughed, shook his head, and said it was all in my head. He mentioned altitude sickness, dehydration, and the way the fog can play tricks on you. I didn't argue, but I felt uneasy. My hands still trembled a bit, and my mouth felt dry. Rob gave me a bottle of water and suggested we go for a short hike to clear my thoughts. I agreed, thinking fresh air might help. We set out on a narrow trail that wound through the pines. The path was covered in fallen needles, making our steps soft and muffled. The fog drifted around us in patches, sometimes rolling across our feet and then lifting higher. I tried to focus on the physical effort of walking, my boots pressing into the earth, the slight burn in my calves, the sound of twigs snapping underfoot. The wind kept picking up, swirling the fog in random directions. Rob seemed at ease, as if he was used to it. But I felt a dull pressure in my chest whenever I looked up at the swirling clouds above the treetops. We trekked for about an hour before the path opened into a small clearing. From there, the view was supposed to be breathtaking. I saw only shifting layers of white. It looked like we were standing on the edge of nothingness. The wind howled all around, but I couldn't see beyond a few feet. Rob said we should turn back. He joked that we wouldn't see a great view in this weather. I nodded, but I was distracted by a noise. I heard a faint murmur like distant voices. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the direction. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere deep in the fog, all around us. It was too soft to make out words, but it had a human quality, like a crowd whispering or mumbling in the distance. I told Rob I heard something. He just shrugged. He said the wind through the trees can create weird echoes, especially when the fog is thick. I tried to ignore it, but as we headed back, the whispering turned into a chorus of overlapping cries. They weren't loud, but they were clear enough to make my hair stand on end. I glanced at Rob, but he was focused on putting one foot in front of the other. My stomach lurched and I broke out in a cold sweat. I realized I was walking faster. Rob asked if I was okay, and I just nodded. I told him I was fine, but I felt panic building in my chest. We got back to the cabin and I almost ran inside. My heart was pounding. The moment I was indoors, I felt some relief. The stale smell of the cabin felt safer than the endless fog outside. Rob asked if I wanted some coffee, and I said yes. We sat at the table again. He turned on an old radio he kept near the window. Static crackled, and we could barely pick up a signal. The faint sound of a distant station came through, talking about a storm front. It was all background noise to me. I kept replaying those voices in my head. I couldn't figure out if they were real or just my imagination. That afternoon, Rob tried to lighten the mood. He told me about a small waterfall nearby and asked if I wanted to check it out. I mumbled something about needing to rest, so he left on his own. I was alone in the cabin and the silence weighed on me. I stepped outside to get some air. The fog had receded a bit around the porch, so I could see the wooden steps and a stretch of rocky ground. I took a deep breath and tried to calm down. I could hear a faint dripping sound near the side of the cabin. I walked around and saw water trickling from a gutter, forming a puddle at the base of a wall. The smell of wet earth rose around me. I heard a branch snap somewhere behind me. My pulse spiked. I turned around, but there was only fog and trees. I felt a sensation of being watched. My shoulders tensed and I gritted my teeth. For a few seconds I just stood there, waiting for something to move. When nothing did, I walked back inside and locked the door. As afternoon shifted into evening, the clouds outside got darker. Rob returned with a shrug, saying the waterfall was just a trickle. He asked if I felt better. I just shrugged back. He suggested we build a fire in the small fireplace. I agreed, hoping the warmth and light might help me relax. We gathered some logs from the woodpile, lit them, and sat on the couch. The fire crackled, sending tiny sparks into the air. We didn't talk much. I watched the flames dance, and for a moment, I felt almost normal. But the fog returned in full force after sunset. It pressed against the windows, turning them into glowing rectangles. The temperature dropped. Rob said goodnight and headed to his room. I stayed near the fire for a while, then decided to go to bed. My bedroom felt colder than before. I closed the window all the way. Even so, I saw a thin line of fog creeping under the door. My heart beat faster. I stuffed a towel at the threshold, hoping to block it. My throat felt tight. I turned off the light and got under the covers. I couldn't sleep. I stared at the dark, listening to my own breathing. About an hour later, I felt that cold draft again. The towel at the door was wet and fog was drifting in anyway. I sat up and looked at the foot of my bed. 3 figures stood there. They were motionless, their outlines faint in the white haze. I saw what looked like shoulders and heads. My stomach twisted, and I felt a hot rush of adrenaline. My chest tightened so hard I could barely breathe. I could taste metal on my tongue. I wanted to scream for Rob, but I was terrified that if I made a sound, these shapes would move closer. I forced myself to flip on the bedside lamp. In that instant, the room looked empty again. The fog swirled a bit, but the shapes were gone. My hands shook as I reached for my phone on the nightstand. I saw no signal, just a blank icon. I turned the lamp off again, then turned it on, off, as if testing whether the figures would show up if it was dark. I felt sweat dripping down my back. Nothing appeared. Eventually, I laid back, but my heart wouldn't slow down. In the morning, I confronted Rob. I told him I saw people in my room. He gave me the same explanation as before, that it was just an illusion, just my mind playing tricks in the fog. He seemed annoyed, like I was insulting his mountain retreat. I wanted to leave that day, but part of me felt compelled to stay. I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't losing it. Rob went out for supplies. I stood on the porch looking at the peaks above, half obscured by gray clouds. I decided to take a walk on my own. I grabbed a flashlight and a water bottle, then headed down a trail I hadn't tried before. The path was narrower, with rocks and uneven steps. The fog wrapped around me pretty quickly, and soon I could only see a few yards in front. Everything was quiet except for my own footsteps. Then the voices started again, soft at first, then louder. They swelled in waves, as if I was surrounded by hundreds of unseen people. My heart pounded, and I felt dizzy. My legs tensed, and I crouched, shining the flashlight in all directions. The light only revealed shifting fog. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded small and shaky. The echoes of my shout came back, twisted and distorted. I heard what sounded like whispered responses, but I couldn't pick out any words. Panic rose in me, and I turned around to go back. Each step felt heavier. My feet slipped on damp leaves. The wind kicked up, and the voices seemed to rise with it. My hands trembled, and I kept the flashlight pointed at the ground to avoid tripping. Eventually, I found my way back to the cabin. I slammed the door behind me and locked it. I paced around the living room, breathing hard. My clothes were damp from the fog, and I felt a chill in my bones. Rob came back an hour later carrying groceries. I told him what happened, and he looked concerned, but still dismissive. He reminded me that altitude can affect the mind, that the damp cold can cause illusions, that I should rest more. I didn't know what else to say. I decided to push through one more night and leave in the morning. That evening, we tried to watch an old movie on a small TV. The reception was bad, but it kept my mind off things for a while. The wind outside became fiercer, rattling the windows. Around 10, Rob said he was going to bed. I stayed up, staring at the weak TV signal until I couldn't keep my eyes open. Then I went to my bedroom and saw that the floor near the door was damp again. I smelled that musty odor of wet fabric. I checked the window, made sure it was locked. I stuffed a fresh towel at the door. I changed into dry clothes and got under the covers, leaving the lamp on this time. I tried to calm my breathing. My eyes burned from lack of sleep. After a while, I must have dozed off. I opened my eyes to find the lamp still on, but now a thick cloud of fog filled the room. I felt cold on my face again. The shapes were back, this time closer to the bed. I saw at least two of them, standing motionless, their outlines more solid than before. They were about an arm's length away from me. My scalp tingled and my chest seized up. My mind went blank except for raw panic. I flailed for the lamp switch, but my hands were shaking so much I missed it at first. When I did manage to turn it off, the shapes vanished along with the light. I flicked it back on. They were gone. My breath came in short gasps. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat up, huddled under a blanket, glaring at the corners of the room, expecting to see them again. By morning, my eyes were bloodshot and my limbs felt weak. I told Rob I was leaving. He tried to persuade me to stay another night, but I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't care if he thought I was losing my mind. I packed my bag and walked out to my car. Standing by the driver's side, I looked up at the mountain. Fog covered the peak like a heavy shroud. I felt the same oppressive weight in the air. For a second, I thought I heard those voices again, drifting on the wind. My stomach turned, and I forced myself to open the car door and get in. Rob waved from the porch. I started the engine, and I took one last glance at the cabin before pulling away. As I drove down the rough mountain road, I realized my heartbeat was slowing, and the tension in my shoulders eased. The fog thinned with every mile I put between myself and that summit. When I finally hit the main highway, the sun was shining through scattered clouds. I felt like I could breathe again. I don't know what I experienced up there. Rob would say it was nothing but hallucinations and altitude sickness, but I'm not so sure. All I know is that the mountain didn't feel empty. It felt alive, and I sensed it watching me every second I stayed. I have no plans to return. Even now, the memory of those silent figures sends a chill across my neck. I'd rather keep my distance from that place. For good. I started working in this old Art Deco building in the center of the city 6 months ago. On my first day, I noticed the ornate lobby. The floors had geometric patterns, and the marble columns had sharp lines carved into them. Everyone I talked to during that day said the building had a certain charm. They pointed out the decorative elevators with their iron gates. They said it was part of the building's legacy from the 1930s. I nodded along, but I couldn't ignore a strange feeling in my chest. It felt heavy. I didn't know if it was anxiety about the new job or the building's atmosphere. I tried to brush it off and focus on my routine. After 2 weeks, I realized I was often the last person to leave the office. My role involved handling financial reports, and these reports tended to pile up. I stayed late to meet deadlines, and I found myself alone in the long corridors. There were times when the silence weighed on me. The overhead lights buzzed. The walls seemed to press in on me. I told myself I was just tired. But every time I walked to the elevator, my skin prickled. The elevator is old. It has a folding gate you have to pull aside before stepping in. There's a manual lever that you operate to choose your floor. It's supposed to be electric now, but it still has that old lever style on the panel. There's a faint smell of grease and metal inside. Sometimes it's mixed with a stale odor. I never liked that smell. I couldn't tell if it was mold or something else. The interior lights are weak. They flicker when the elevator moves. The floor is made of dark tiles, and the walls are lined with scratched steel panels. One night, around 9 p.m., I packed my bag and headed for the elevator. The corridor lights were already dimmed for the night. As I approached the elevator, I saw something that made me stop. The elevator gate was open, but I was sure I left it closed when I came up. I looked around. The corridor was empty. I could see the reflection of a single overhead bulb on the polished floor. My heart pounded. I took a few breaths and stepped into the elevator. I closed the gate and pressed the button for the lobby. As it started moving, I felt a slight jolt, and the lights flickered once, then stayed on. Nothing happened until the elevator reached the 5th floor. It stopped. The gate stayed closed, but the elevator just paused. I hadn't pressed 5. I tried pressing the lobby button again, but it didn't move. I could hear the hum of the motor. I waited for a few seconds. Then, without warning, it continued down. It didn't open the gate at the 5th floor or anything. It just went straight to the lobby after that brief delay. I walked out, trying to seem calm, but my hands were clammy. My breath felt tight. The lobby security guard was busy at his desk, so I just waved goodbye and left. I told myself it was a glitch. The next day I stayed late again. This time it was 10 p.m. when I finished. I grabbed my coat, locked my office, and walked down the corridor to the elevator. The place was silent. I could only hear my own footsteps. They echoed in the hallway. When I reached the elevator, I heard a soft clank inside the shaft. It sounded like the elevator was moving. I pressed the call button. The sound stopped. The elevator arrived. The gate slid open. I saw no one inside. I stepped in, pressed the button for the lobby, and waited. The ride was quiet until the 6th floor. Then it stopped on 6. The gate slid open by itself. I looked out into the dark hallway. No lights were on. I peered into the hallway and whispered, "Anyone there?" There was no answer. I pressed the lobby button again. Nothing happened for a moment. My pulse felt like it was hammering in my neck. The gate stayed open and the elevator stayed on the 6th floor. After a few seconds, the gate slid shut on its own, and the elevator continued down. When I got to the lobby, I saw the guard again. He greeted me, but I didn't say much. I just nodded and left. My stomach felt twisted. My throat was dry. I needed fresh air. Outside, the city lights and the cool breeze made me feel a bit better. I told myself I was stressed and that old elevators sometimes acted weird. I decided not to mention it to my boss or coworkers. I didn't want them to think I was losing it. 2 weeks later, I stayed after hours to finish an important report. It was around 8 p.m. I stepped out to get a soda from the vending machine. The machine is at the end of the hallway. I heard something near the elevator. I heard the gate rattling, like someone was opening or closing it. I glanced down the hallway and saw a figure. It looked like a tall man wearing a dark suit and a hat. I froze. He seemed to open the elevator gate, step inside, and then the gate shut. I walked closer, but by the time I reached the elevator, it wasn't moving. I pressed the call button. It was on my floor. The gate opened. The elevator was empty. The overhead light flickered. I felt a chill go through my back. I ran my hand over my face. I tried to calm down. I grabbed my soda and went back to my desk. I stayed there until I had the courage to leave around 9:30 p.m. Over the next few days, I started avoiding the elevator whenever possible. I used the stairs if I had to come or go outside regular hours, but sometimes the elevator was unavoidable. My office is on the 8th floor, and hauling heavy file boxes by the stairs was tough. One evening, I had to bring some archived documents down to the basement storage. I dreaded using that old elevator, but I had no choice. I took the files, loaded them onto a small cart, and rolled it into the elevator. I pressed the button for the basement. The elevator groaned on the way down. The lights flickered more than usual. By the time I reached the basement, I felt sweat on my forehead. The basement itself is dimly lit. There's a single corridor with a few overhead lights, and the storage room is at the far end. The walls smell of mildew and old paint. I unloaded the boxes into the storage room, locked the door, and headed back toward the elevator. As I approached, I heard something. It sounded like footsteps moving inside the elevator shaft. They echoed, like someone was climbing up or down the metal framework. I stood still and listened. The sound stopped. The overhead light flickered in the corridor. I opened the gate. No one was there. I stepped in, pressed 8, and watched the gate close. The elevator started up. About halfway to the lobby, it shook. I felt my stomach drop. The elevator slowed, then continued. I kept my eyes on the small floor indicator. It passed the ground floor and kept going. At the 4th floor, it stopped again. The gate opened. The hallway lights were off. It was late. I heard a faint whisper. It didn't sound like words. It sounded like soft breathing or someone muttering under their breath. My skin tingled and my heart pounded. I jammed the button for 8. The gate shut and the elevator rose again. When I got out on my floor, I hurried to my office, locked the door, and sat at my desk. My hands were shaking. I tried to focus on paperwork, but my mind kept replaying those whispers. The next day, I asked the building manager if there were any mechanical issues with the elevator. I kept my tone casual. He said everything was normal. He admitted the elevator was old and could be noisy, but he didn't mention anything about phantom stops or random whispers. I didn't push the subject. I just nodded and left. That night, I found myself alone in the office again. The city outside was bright, but inside everything felt lifeless. The air was stuffy. I decided to leave before it got too late. I packed my bag and walked to the elevator. I tried to stay calm. My palms were sweating. My back was tense. I reached the elevator and looked around one last time. The corridor was empty. The overhead lights buzzed. I pulled the gate open and stepped in. I pressed the lobby button. The elevator jerked, then began its descent. The ride was smooth until the 6th floor. Then it stopped without me pressing anything. The gate opened. The hallway was dim. No one stood there. I felt my breath catch. I stepped forward to check the hallway. My foot touched the threshold. Suddenly, the lights in the hallway turned off. I heard the switch click. My heart jumped. I moved back into the elevator and pressed the lobby button repeatedly. The gate closed slowly, like something was resisting it. Then it finally latched. The elevator went down one more floor and stopped again at the 5th floor. This time the lights in the hallway were on. I saw the corridor. It was empty, but I heard a scraping sound behind the closed doors of an office. I didn't investigate. I stayed in the elevator, pressing the button. My hands were trembling. The elevator moved again, stopping at the lobby. I rushed out. The security guard wasn't at his desk. I didn't bother waiting. I pushed open the main doors and stepped onto the sidewalk. The cool air hit my face, my knees felt weak. I stood there for a moment, breathing hard. I turned around and looked at the lobby. No one was inside. The guard must have been in the back room or in the restroom. I decided I didn't want to talk to anyone about this. I just wanted to go home. For the next few weeks, I had these experiences on and off. Sometimes the elevator operated normally, and I wondered if I had imagined everything. Other times it stopped on random floors. I heard strange noises that didn't make sense. I tried to record audio on my phone once, but all I got was static. That night, the elevator never acted up. It felt like the building was playing games with me. Then one Friday night, I had to send an urgent email to a client. I stayed until 7 p.m. That wasn't too late, so I felt okay. I gathered my things and headed for the elevator. When I got there, I felt a sudden drop in temperature. My arms tingled. I hit the call button. The elevator arrived. As I stepped in, I saw the reflection of someone standing behind me in the steel panel. They wore a hat. I spun around. No one was there. I stood still, heart racing. The gate started to close on its own. I jumped to the control panel and pressed the lobby button, hoping it would just take me down without any interruptions. The elevator passed the 7th floor, the 6th floor, then the 5th floor. I watched the dial. Everything was smooth. I exhaled, thinking maybe it would be a normal ride. Then it jerked to a stop between the 3rd and 2nd floor. The lights flickered and went out. I was in complete darkness. I could only hear my own breathing. I fumbled for my phone. My hands were sweaty, and my chest felt tight. I turned on the phone's flashlight. I shined it around. The elevator was empty. The gate was closed. I pressed the emergency button. The motor whirred and the lights came back on. The elevator resumed its descent. It stopped at the lobby. When the gate opened, I practically ran out. I saw the security guard standing by his desk, sipping coffee. I told him the elevator got stuck for a second. He looked surprised. He apologized for not noticing. He said he'd inform the manager. I nodded and left. I walked straight to my car, got in, and sat there for a while, trying to steady my breathing. My shirt was damp from sweat. My heart was still pounding. Over the weekend, I couldn't stop thinking about that moment in the dark. The reflection of that hat kept replaying in my mind. I considered quitting, but I needed the job. On Monday, I went in early and tried to talk to the building manager again. I asked if anyone had reported odd occurrences. He shook his head. He asked if I was okay. I forced a smile and said I was. Then I went to my office. I felt uneasy all day. That evening, I left exactly at 5 p.m. to avoid being alone. Everything was calm for a while, but deadlines piled up again, and a few days later, I stayed until 8 p.m. As I gathered my coat, I heard footsteps in the hallway. I assumed it was a coworker. I looked out, but no one was there. The sound continued like heavy shoes pacing back and forth. I felt my heart tighten. I decided I couldn't stay in the office. I turned off the lights and locked the door. I followed the corridor to the elevator. I heard a faint whisper near my ear. It sounded like someone breathing in my personal space. I swung around, shining my phone light, but I saw nothing. I walked faster. When I reached the elevator, I heard the gate clank open by itself. I leaned forward and saw the elevator was right there, as if it had been waiting for me. I considered taking the stairs, but my office was on the 8th floor. My legs were tired, and I had a heavy bag with me. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the lobby button. The gate closed with a metallic snap. The ride was silent until the 7th floor. The elevator slowed, but then it picked up speed again. At the 5th floor, it stopped. The gate slid open. I could see the dark hallway. The overhead light in the elevator blinked, and I saw that hat again, just for a second, near the edge of the gate. I gasped and stumbled back. Then the elevator gate slammed shut, and the elevator continued down. When I reached the lobby, I felt a rush of relief. I got out, nodded at the guard, and walked outside. My legs were weak. I stood on the sidewalk, breathing the cool evening air. I told myself that was enough. I made a plan to talk to my boss about working different hours. I couldn't handle these late nights anymore. At least if I left with the crowd, I wouldn't be alone in that elevator. I tried to calm myself. I looked at the building's facade. The Art Deco details were supposed to be beautiful, but I only felt a sense of dread. I checked my watch. It was 8:15 p.m. The street was half empty. Headlights from passing cars lit the sidewalk in short bursts. I realized I had no proof of anything. There were no security tapes showing a man in a hat. No one else had mentioned seeing anything strange. Maybe others had experiences but never talked about them. Maybe they didn't stay late enough. I don't know. All I know is that every time I use that elevator alone, I feel watched. I hear whispers I can't explain. I see the gate open on floors where nobody should be. I see glimpses of a figure I can never find. I keep telling myself I'll quit, but so far I haven't. I keep hoping management will upgrade the elevator or that we'll move to a different building. But until that happens, I just try to avoid staying late. If I do have to stay, I stay in my office until I see a coworker in the hallway, and then I slip out with them. It's not perfect, but I don't know what else to do. I can't prove anything, and I don't think it would help if I tried. That's how it is. I work in an old Art Deco building with an antique elevator. It moves by itself at night. It stops on floors nobody called. Sometimes I catch a glimpse of a hat or hear muted whispers. No one else admits to seeing or hearing anything. But I can't ignore what I've experienced. It's not imagination. It's real enough for me. And as long as I have to stay in that place, I'll keep my guard up every time I step into that elevator. I'll breathe shallowly. I'll feel my heart thump against my rib cage. I'll watch the gate, waiting for it to open on some empty floor again. And I'll try not to think about what I might see if it does. I started my shift at the cemetery with a flashlight in my hand and a strange feeling in my chest. I was already on edge because I'd found a small structure on the far edge of the property that didn't match anything in the old files. My boss told me to leave it alone, but that didn't sit right with me. I'm the caretaker here, and I like to know every corner of this place. The main paths are well lit, and I keep those areas tidy, but there's a section near the back with thick trees and uneven ground. That's where I saw this odd building for the first time. It looked like a stone mausoleum, but the roof was slightly curved, and the door seemed heavier than the others. I never saw anyone near it, and it wasn't marked on any official map. I'm a man who doesn't scare easily. I've worked at this historical cemetery for a while, doing all the usual maintenance jobs. I sweep the walkways, trim the bushes, check the fences for gaps, and make sure nobody is trespassing at night. I also keep an eye on any unusual damage. Most days feel calm, but this place has its quirks. Sometimes old gates creak by themselves. Sometimes I hear rustling in the bushes. I'm used to that. The wind and local wildlife make plenty of noise, and it rarely bothers me. But this structure changed my routine. The first time I walked past it, I heard a faint sound that made my spine tense. I thought it was a radio at first, maybe from a nearby house. But the noise seemed too crisp, like piano keys. I stood there with my flashlight off, holding my breath. The sound faded. I waited a few seconds, then turned the beam of light on the door. It was locked. The door looked old, covered in thick rust. I tried to see inside through a small gap near the top, but I couldn't make out much. The interior looked dark. I thought maybe I imagined the music, so I shrugged it off and went on with my rounds. The next day, I tried to find a record of this building in the cemetery's archives. This place is historical, so we have old folders, handwritten notes, and a handful of typed documents from decades ago. I flipped through them on my lunch break in the little office by the front gate. I found references to crypts and mausoleums belonging to notable families, but nothing that described that particular shape or location. Some of the oldest documents mentioned expansions or renovations, but still nothing matched the building I'd seen. It bugged me, but I couldn't jump to conclusions. Maybe it was a private crypt that someone forgot to register properly. That night, I took the long path around, trying to avoid that area. I was a little uneasy after my previous experience. The moon wasn't out, so the dark felt heavier than usual. I moved my flashlight from side to side, scanning the headstones in the trees. When I got close to that structure, I heard piano music again. This time, it was louder and clearer. I could recognize a slow melody, each note distinct. My heartbeat picked up and my palms started sweating. My mouth got dry. I tried to stay calm, but my hands shook a bit as I held the flashlight. I stood there and listened. The music didn't skip or warble. It sounded smooth, like someone practiced that piece for years. I had no reason to believe anyone was inside, but I couldn't ignore that sound. I walked up to the door. I pressed my ear against the stone. I heard the piano better there, like I was standing next to a real piano bench. I tried to turn the handle. It didn't budge. The lock felt solid. I tapped on the door. The music stopped. I yelled, "Hello? Is anyone in there?" No answer. I stepped back and felt a chill spread across my neck and shoulders. I looked around to see if maybe the sound came from somewhere else. The night was silent, except for a slight breeze. I got my phone out to check for a signal, though I had no idea what I planned to do with that. I guess I thought about calling a coworker, but the phone had no bars back there. I felt nervous, like I was doing something I shouldn't. I decided to walk away and finish my patrol. The next morning, I returned during daylight. The structure looked plain under the sun. The walls were gray, the roof was covered in old chipped tiles, and there was a stone engraving near the top. It was too eroded to read. I tried the door again, still locked. I circled the building. On the other side, I noticed a small window, covered with iron bars. The glass behind the bars was dusty, and I couldn't see inside. I tried shining my flashlight through, but the angle was bad. The interior just looked dark. I considered prying the bars loose, but I decided against it. I didn't have the right tools, and I didn't want to damage property without approval. That afternoon, I searched the archives once more. I went through old boxes in the storage room. I opened brittle folders that smelled like old paper. I found records of tombs from about 100 years ago. Handwritten notes described the owners, the plots, the cost for maintenance, but nothing about that crypt. Just as I was about to give up, a smaller notebook fell out of a stack. It had no label on the cover. Inside, someone had made partial sketches of the cemetery layout. The drawings were rough. The caretaker at the time might have jotted them down to plan repairs. On the last page, I saw a shape that looked like the structure I kept seeing. Next to it was a scribbled note. Strange addition, not on official list. That was it. No date, no explanation. I felt my heart skip a beat. I had proof that someone noticed it before. When I went on my evening rounds, I heard the piano music for the third time. It was the same slow melody, almost hypnotic. I decided to do more than just knock. I shined my flashlight around the edges of the door, looking for gaps or hidden latches. The music kept playing. My breathing got faster. My chest felt tight. The notes sounded too perfect. My mind kept saying this shouldn't be possible. The building looked abandoned. It had no electricity or windows big enough for a piano to fit inside. I tried pushing on the door with my shoulder. It felt solid as a rock. I didn't want to break anything, but I felt this urge to get inside. I slammed my fist against the door a few times. The music stopped. My ears rang with the sudden silence. Then I heard a shuffle from within, like someone shifting on a wooden bench. I froze. I whispered, "Who's there?" Nothing. After a few seconds, the music started up again, repeating the same melody. My hands felt sweaty, and I wiped them on my pants. I backed away. Every hair on my arm stood up. I walked off, feeling unsettled. Later that night, I dreamed about the crypt. I saw myself inside, holding a flashlight over a piano. A stack of papers sat on top of the piano. My name, Jacob, was scribbled in the margins. I woke up with a jerk, sweat on my forehead. I told myself it was just a dream, but it stayed with me all morning. On my next shift, I couldn't stop thinking about the place. I decided to bring a crowbar. I kept it in a tool bag with some wrenches and screwdrivers. Around midnight, when the grounds were silent, I walked straight to that crypt. The music started before I even arrived. The same slow tune, repeated again and again. My heart pounded. I felt sweat running down my back and my throat felt tight. I gripped the crowbar. When I got to the door, I set the flashlight on the ground. I wedged the crowbar between the door and the frame. I gave it a good yank. The metal screeched. My muscles strained and I felt my arms shaking. The music inside kept going, no change in tempo. I pulled harder and the old lock snapped. The door swung open an inch. I heard a pop, then silence. The piano stopped. I held my breath, pushed the door open further and pointed my flashlight inside. The air felt dense, like I'd walked into a place that hadn't been opened in decades. Dust hung in the beam of light. My nose itched. The walls were stone. In the center of the small room, I saw an upright piano covered in a sheet. The sheet looked stained with time and the corners were frayed. I stepped inside, shining the light around. There was no one there. It was just me and that piano. In the corner, I saw a small wooden table piled with old papers. My hands shook a little as I stepped toward the table. My mouth felt dry. I kept expecting someone to jump out from behind the piano, but no one did. I picked up the top sheet. The handwriting looked old and faded. Musical notes spread across the page. On the side, I saw my first name written in clear letters, Jacob. The date at the top read 1920. That was about 100 years ago. My heart thudded in my chest. I skimmed the text. There were references to a caretaker. Next to it was my last name, spelled correctly. It described small details: my hair color, my height, my job duties. It even mentioned the brand of flashlight I used. I felt my stomach flip. I checked the other papers. They were more or less the same. Some were rough sketches of the cemetery, with notes about my route. Some included details about the jeans and boots I wore. I swallowed hard. My breath came in quick bursts. My skin felt clammy. I stood there trying to process everything. The smell of old paper and stone filled my nose. I heard a dripping sound in the corner, maybe from groundwater. The piano stood silently. I lifted the sheet, and the piano's wood looked pristine. I pressed one key gently. The note rang out, matching the tone I'd heard from outside. I felt a flash of anxiety. I looked around for any sign of a hidden speaker or something that might explain the music. There was nothing. I noticed a smaller notebook under the stack of papers. I slid it out. The cover was cracked leather. Inside, I saw more handwriting in the same style as the sheet music. Some pages had short entries, describing nights when the caretaker walked by. They mentioned specific times, like, caretaker walked past at 11:13 p.m., carrying a flashlight in his left hand. They noted my exact route across the grounds. The final entry read, "He will open the door soon. He will see these pages. He will wonder how this is possible. He must keep this place safe." I didn't understand. My breathing got heavier. My heart pounded so hard that I felt it in my throat. My legs felt shaky. I stood there, shining my light across the small room. The stone walls were bare. There were no chairs, no benches, no personal items besides the piano and the stack of papers. I wondered if I'd stepped into some trick. Maybe the old caretaker left these notes as a prank. But the details about my flashlight and my clothes were too accurate and recent. I thought about grabbing all the papers and showing them to my boss, but I felt a strange urge to leave them there. I forced myself to calm down and took a few photos with my phone. The flash lit up the space for a moment, and I saw faint carvings on the walls. They looked like random marks or attempts at musical bars. It was hard to tell. I wiped sweat off my forehead. My body felt tense, like I was ready to run out the door any second. I decided to check the piano a bit more. I lifted the lid where the strings were. Everything appeared in working order. No dust on the hammers. It looked like it had been maintained. That made no sense. No one should be in here. There's no caretaker for a crypt that doesn't exist in the official records. I pressed a few keys. The sound was pure and clear. My skin prickled. I stepped back, breathing hard through my mouth. After a few moments, I forced myself to exit. I couldn't stay in there any longer. I felt like I was being watched, even though I was alone. I stepped outside. The night air hit me in the face, and I exhaled loudly. My hands shook. I locked the door from the outside by jamming the broken lock as best I could. Then I hurried back to the main path. My mind spun with questions. I couldn't explain what I'd seen or how my name appeared on documents from a century ago. I didn't understand the music. The memory of that slow melody stuck in my head, and I couldn't shake it. Back at the little office, I sat down and tried to write a report about what happened. I left out the part about the mysterious notes with my name. I just mentioned that I found an unlisted crypt with old furniture inside. I said the door was locked, but the lock was broken, so I sealed it with a temporary latch. I stared at the blank space in the incident form where I should have explained the details. My stomach churned. I felt a headache coming on. I saved the file without sending it. I didn't know who would believe me anyway. I still work here. I pass by that structure every night. Sometimes I hear the piano music, sometimes I don't. I haven't gone back inside since that evening. I think about it a lot, though. The images of my name on those old papers won't leave my mind. I keep telling myself there must be some logical reason. Yet every time I pass that stone building, I feel my pulse rise, and the memory of that melody drifts through my thoughts. I wonder if the piano is still covered. I wonder if the pages are still spread across the little table. I wonder if someone or something wrote more notes. I never mentioned any of this to my boss or coworkers. They don't ask questions, and I don't volunteer information. I keep my flashlight aimed straight ahead when I patrol that area. When I catch myself looking at that worn door, I think about the times I heard the music. I remember how it stopped whenever I knocked. That tension sits in my chest every time I see the building in my peripheral vision. I don't have answers. I haven't found a neat explanation. I only know I can't erase those images from my head. The old date on the sheet music, the handwriting that described me and my life, the perfect tone of that piano, and the quiet hush the moment I forced my way inside. I can't forget how wrong it felt to stand there in the dusty space with no one at the keys, hearing only the echo of my own breathing. That's my story. That's what keeps me on edge whenever I walk through the back of the cemetery at night. I just do my job and try not to linger. But sometimes I swear I can still hear the faint outline of that melody drifting on the air, right behind the heavy door that shouldn't exist. I moved into this place because the price was too low to ignore. The listing said it was over 100 years old. The seller mentioned some minor repairs, but nothing out of the ordinary. The neighborhood was quiet, and I liked the idea of living in a piece of history. I had no real expectations besides making it my home. After I signed the papers, I felt satisfied. I had a new place with big windows, high ceilings, and a huge attic. I thought I scored a great deal. Then the whispers started. I heard them on my first night. I was in bed, half asleep, and I heard a soft noise above me. It sounded like someone calling my name, but it was so quiet that I wasn't sure if I dreamed it. I got out of bed and walked to the hallway. I flipped on the light, but the bulb flickered. I stood there listening. The attic entrance was near the end of the hallway. The whispers seemed to come from there. They stopped as soon as I got close. I didn't feel anything weird yet, just a little uneasy about being in a dark hall. I looked at the closed attic door in the ceiling, felt a slight chill, and walked back to my bedroom. I thought maybe I was tired, or imagined it. The next day I woke up and tried to forget about it. I did some unpacking, set up a couple of shelves in the living room, and made lunch in my new kitchen. I was excited about the old-fashioned fixtures. The sink had these detailed brass handles, and there was a big pantry that smelled like old wood. Everything felt normal until late afternoon. I was on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I heard the whispers again. It was the same soft calling of my name. It echoed for maybe 2 seconds, then died. It felt like a breeze passed through the room, but there were no windows open. I stood up, walked around, checked the doors. Nothing. The sound had no clear origin, but it seemed to come from upstairs. I decided to explore the attic. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed up. The attic hatch was a bit stiff. It took more effort than I expected. The stairs creaked loudly under my weight. When I reached the top, I felt a sudden drop in temperature. It wasn't freezing, just a sharp difference from downstairs. The air smelled stale. There were old boxes, a few broken chairs, some scattered tools, and a large trunk against the far wall. A single hanging bulb lit the space, but the corners stayed dark. I stood there, scanning the room. My breath felt tight. My arms tensed up, and I could feel goosebumps forming along the back of my neck. I thought I heard something again, like a faint breath. I aimed the flashlight at the corner. Nothing moved. I walked over to the trunk, curious about what was inside. I tried to open it, but it was locked. I shook it a little and heard a dull thud from within, like something shifting. My heart started pounding faster, and I felt a faint sense of dread. I had no logical reason for it. I just felt unsettled. Then I heard the floorboards creak. I turned around fast, shining the flashlight. No one was there. I swallowed hard. I said, "Hello?" My voice sounded shaky and too loud in the attic. No response. I left, half convinced I was just spooking myself. That night, the whispers got louder. I was brushing my teeth and I heard my name again, this time more distinct. "Daniel," it whispered. My pulse jumped. I spat out the toothpaste and turned off the faucet. The house was silent for a moment. I opened the bathroom door and looked down the dark hallway. I listened carefully. Then I heard it again. "Daniel." It stretched the syllables. My spine felt cold, and my hands started shaking. I ran to my bedroom, slammed the door, and turned on the lamp. I sat on the bed, heart pounding, trying to calm down. I told myself it was the house settling, or maybe a draft. But I knew what I heard. The next morning, I decided to buy a few cameras. I went to a local electronics store and got a basic security system. I placed one camera in the hallway facing the attic door. I put another in the attic itself, aimed at the trunk and the darkest corner. I set them to record continuously. I felt a bit ridiculous, like I was overreacting, but I needed to see if anyone was getting into my house or messing around. The day went by quietly. I cooked dinner, watched TV, and tried not to think about the whispers. Later that night, I sat down at my computer to check the camera feeds. I watched hours of footage. There was nothing unusual. The attic camera showed a still, dusty room. The hallway camera captured me walking around, flipping lights on and off, going in and out of the bathroom. No intruders, no unexplained shadows. I started to think maybe I was just hearing things. But then I looked at the audio levels. The program I used showed spikes in sound at random intervals. I played one clip back, but I didn't hear anything except faint static. Then I noticed that if I turned the volume all the way up, I could hear a strange, low murmur. It was too distorted to make out words. I listened again, pressing my headphones against my ears. My own name seemed to surface through the noise. It sent a jolt of fear through me. There was no one in the video, but the microphone picked up something. I marked the time codes and saved the files. I couldn't sleep that night. I tossed and turned, worried about who or what was in my attic. At around 2 a.m., I had a dream. In the dream, I was standing in the attic, and there was a man in a black suit. He stood in the far corner where the light didn't reach. He didn't move or speak. His face was blurry, as if I couldn't focus on it. I felt trapped, like my feet were stuck to the floor. I couldn't look away from him. I woke up drenched in sweat, breathing hard, my heart hammering in my chest. I sat up, grabbed my phone and checked the time. It was 2:10 a.m. I wiped my face on my sleeve, tried to calm down, and eventually drifted into a restless sleep. The next day, I went back to the attic. It was daytime, so it felt a little safer. The light coming through the small attic windows made the place look less menacing. Still, my skin prickled as soon as I climbed up. I kept imagining that man in the black suit standing in the corner. I walked over to the trunk again. The lock looked old and a bit rusty. I pulled on it, gave it a few jerks, but it wouldn't budge. I considered breaking it, but I didn't have the right tools with me. I decided to look inside the boxes instead. Most were empty. One had some old newspapers from the 1960s. Another held a broken lamp and some tarnished silverware. Nothing weird. Nothing that explained the voices. I spent the rest of the day installing better lighting in the attic. I replaced the single bulb with a brighter LED fixture. I swept the floor, pushed the trunk against the wall, and tried to reorganize some of the junk. I hoped it would help me feel more in control. The entire time my chest felt tight, and I had this weird expectation that I'd hear the whispers at any moment. My nerves were on edge, but the attic stayed silent while I worked. That night I checked the camera feeds again. Just like before, no sign of movement. The audio, however, showed those spikes. I listened to a few sections and heard that same low murmur. It made me feel sick to my stomach. I turned off the computer and decided to watch some mindless TV until I got sleepy. Around midnight, I headed to bed. I left the hallway light on because I didn't like the idea of total darkness. I fell asleep quickly, but the dream returned. This time, the man in the black suit was closer. He stood a few steps away from me. I saw his outline clearly, but his face was in shadow. My heart was racing in the dream, and I kept hearing my name repeated in a whisper. I woke up to my own voice, mumbling something I couldn't remember. My arms were tense, and my jaw hurt from clenching my teeth. I sat up and stared at the darkness in my bedroom. The hallway light was still on, and it cast a narrow band of light under the door. I didn't hear any whispers then, but I felt like I was being watched. I got up, opened the door, and looked down the hall. Empty. I forced myself to check the attic hatch. It was closed. I locked my bedroom door and tried to go back to sleep, but I kept my eyes open for a long time. The next morning, I called a friend, told him I might have an animal in the attic. I didn't mention the voices or the dream. We checked around, looked for any signs of rodents or raccoons. We found nothing. No droppings, no nests, no holes. It all looked normal. My friend laughed and said maybe I was haunted. I forced a chuckle, but I felt uneasy. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee. My hands were shaking and my stomach felt tight. I stared at the ceiling, imagining the old beams and the trunk above me. It felt like the house was holding on to something. I spent the next few nights trying to record more evidence. I placed audio recorders in several rooms. I checked everything the next day and found more of those bizarre sounds. They were always faint, always spaced out. At times, I thought I heard a few words. Come. Closer. Stay. I wasn't totally sure if that was real or if my mind was filling in the gaps. The stress was affecting me. My appetite dropped. I felt jumpy at small sounds. I double-checked my locks at night. My dreams were always the same. That man in the suit, standing in the darkest part of the attic. After a week of this, I decided I needed to get into that trunk. I went to the hardware store, bought a crowbar, and headed upstairs. My heart was pounding by the time I reached the attic. The air felt heavy. I set up a flashlight on a small stool, aimed it at the trunk, and jammed the crowbar under the latch. It took some force, but eventually the lock snapped. The lid creaked when I opened it. Inside, there were some old clothes, a pair of leather shoes, some letters tied with a brittle cord, and a small photograph in a wooden frame. The photo was black and white, showing a man in a black suit. I couldn't see his face clearly, but he had that same shape as in my dreams. My throat went dry. I could feel my hands tremble as I held the picture. I set it aside and looked through the clothes. They smelled musty, like they'd been in there for decades. The shoes were scuffed and worn. The letters were in cursive handwriting, but the ink had faded. They seemed personal, mentioning the house, but I couldn't read every detail because some words were unreadable. My brain was on overdrive. All I could focus on was the man in the photo. He had that formal, old-fashioned look, standing stiffly with no smile. The background showed what looked like the attic, but it was hard to tell. I placed everything back in the trunk, except the photo. I kept it in my hand, staring at it. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was right behind me. I spun around. Nothing there. I left the attic, feeling dizzy. I started having more frequent nightmares. The suit man never spoke. He never moved. He just stood there, looking my way. I couldn't see his eyes or mouth, but I felt his focus. The next day, I tried to distract myself by working on some repairs around the house. I replaced a few loose floorboards, fixed a leaky faucet, and swept the front porch. The routine tasks helped me stay busy, but my nerves were shot. Every so often, I'd catch myself glancing upstairs, worried I'd see something. At night, the voices felt louder than before. The sound seemed to come through the walls. I sat in the living room, all the lights on, and listened. It was a constant hush, like a person breathing my name. I wanted to run outside and drive away, but I forced myself to stay calm. My chest felt tight, my scalp tingled, my hands were cold and damp. I pushed back against the fear, telling myself it was just a house, an old place with creaky wood and weird acoustics. But deep down I knew there was more to it. I started talking to the empty space, asking it what it wanted. I didn't get an answer, just that whisper repeating my name. I tried to ignore it and watch TV, but my concentration was ruined. I turned the volume up, but the whispered words just slid under the noise. I slammed my hands on the coffee table and shouted, "Stop!" The voices faded for a second, then came back. I felt helpless. I decided to check the camera feeds one more time. I scanned every second of footage from the attic cam. There was nothing visible, just the faint flickers of dust in the air. The audio was a mess of static. But then I noticed a single frame where the static changed shape. It looked like a shadow. I advanced it frame by frame, and I saw a silhouette in the corner. It matched the shape of the man in my dreams. The figure lasted only a moment. My hand shook on the mouse, and I felt a sting of panic in my chest. The next frame, he was gone. I replayed it 5 times, double-checking. Same fleeting shadow. I saved the file and turned off the computer. I felt shaky all over. My legs were weak and I needed to sit. I sank into the chair, staring at the blank monitor. I kept seeing that silhouette in my head. It was the same presence I felt every time I heard my name. He was there, just out of sight, calling me to the attic. My phone buzzed and I almost jumped out of my skin. It was a friend asking how I was settling in. I lied and said everything was fine. I didn't want anyone to think I was losing it. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that black suit. The house felt like it was alive with tension. The walls creaked more than usual. The wind outside seemed to rattle the windows. I got out of bed around 3 a.m. and walked down the hallway. I stood under the attic hatch, staring up at it. My heart pounded. I reached up and touched the latch, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. The cold air around the hatch made my arm hairs stand on end. I whispered, "What do you want?" No answer, just silence. My throat felt dry. My mouth tasted stale. I kept my hand there for a moment, then I backed away and returned to my room. I'm still in this house. I think about leaving, but I already bought the place. I can't just abandon it. I'm trying to figure out what's happening here. I keep the cameras rolling and I listen to the recordings every day. Sometimes I think I hear new words in those whispers. Sometimes they sound angry, other times sad. The man in the black suit still visits my dreams. He's always in that corner, half shrouded, calling me. My stomach ties in knots every time I step into the attic, and the tension in my shoulders won't let up. I don't know why this thing chose me, or why it stays hidden, but I'm determined to find out. This house has secrets, and they revolve around that trunk, that photograph, and the whispers that echo through the halls. I live with this anxiety day and night. I feel it in the way my pulse races when a door creaks. I feel it in my stiff muscles and my quickened breathing whenever I climb those attic stairs. Something is here, something that wants me to know it exists. And now I can't leave this behind. I have to face it. This is my house now, and I have to find a way to make sense of whatever's lurking in the dark. Two weeks ago, I hung an old family portrait in my living room. At first, I thought it would give the space a vintage vibe, something to balance out the modern furniture. I didn't know it would make me question my sanity. I remember the day I found that painting in a dusty box in my parents' attic. My mother told me it was a distant ancestor, someone we barely knew about. She didn't remember when the painting arrived in our home. She just said it had been around for generations. It felt wrong to leave it hidden away. I thought it deserved a place on my wall. I never expected it to follow me at night. I live alone in a modest house on the outskirts of town. I have a small living room connected to the kitchen, and the painting is the first thing you see when you walk in. It shows a man with strong features wearing clothes from some century-long past. His eyes are dark, but there's a trace of intensity there, like he wants to make a statement. The frame is made of thick wood with detailed carvings. It feels heavy. I only managed to hang it because I used a sturdy hook. After I put it up, I stood back and admired it. It looked right, as if it belonged there. For a few days, nothing strange happened. I came home from work, dropped my keys on the kitchen table, and ate dinner in front of the TV. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of the painting out of the corner of my eye. I didn't think anything of it. But one night I was watching a late movie. I turned off the TV around midnight, feeling a bit tired. As I passed by the painting, I had a sudden urge to pause. I glanced at the man's eyes. It felt like they locked onto me. My skin prickled. I stared for a few seconds, but I told myself it was just my imagination. The next night, I noticed the same thing. The eyes seemed to shift. When I walked from the living room to the kitchen, I got the sense that those eyes were tracking me. I looked over my shoulder. The painting was still, but there was this cold heaviness in the air. My arms felt clammy, and a small chill crawled up my back. I tried to shake it off by turning on some music. My heart was beating a bit faster than usual. I wasn't exactly scared, but I was on edge. A few days later, I was cooking dinner. I heard a creaking sound from the living room, like a floorboard shifting. My house does have some old boards, so they tend to make noise. But this was different. It felt like someone was stepping on that creaky spot next to the couch. I turned off the stove, stepped into the living room, and flicked on the overhead light. Everything looked normal. The painting was there, dimly lit by the lamp on my side table. I tried to listen for more sounds, but there was nothing. My skin felt tight, and I realized I was gripping my spatula harder than I should. Eventually, I went back to cooking, but my appetite was gone. That same night, I decided to take a closer look at the painting. I sat on the couch with the table lamp shining directly on the canvas. The paint looked worn, with cracks running through the background. The man's eyes had this glossy sheen. I could see brush strokes that suggested the painter took special care with that part of the face. I leaned in and spotted something odd near the edges of the canvas. The color was slightly different, like there was another layer beneath the surface. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and examined it more carefully. Sure enough, there was a faint outline of something else. It looked like a second face hidden under the paint. I couldn't see it clearly, but I knew it wasn't part of the background. I felt my stomach tighten. I placed the painting on the floor and tried to peel back a tiny bit of the top layer. I only managed to loosen a small fragment. I didn't want to destroy the artwork, so I stopped. I sat there, wondering why someone would paint a new portrait on top of an older one. My hands were shaking a little. I was annoyed at myself for being so jumpy, but I couldn't deny that the painting felt strange. It gave off a kind of static energy, like something buzzing beneath the surface. I got up to fetch a glass of water. As soon as I stepped into the kitchen, I heard a dull thud behind me. I rushed back to the living room, heart pounding. The painting was still on the floor, leaning against the couch. Nothing else seemed out of place. I stood there feeling tense. My arms were prickling with goosebumps. I realized I needed to calm down, so I took a deep breath and sat back on the couch. I told myself it was late, and I was just tired. That night I had a dream. I saw the ancestor in the portrait. He was standing in my living room wearing the same outfit. I saw him move his lips like he wanted to tell me something. I heard my name, but it was distorted, almost like a low hiss. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The clock on my nightstand read 3 a.m. I didn't go back to sleep. The next morning I tried to stick to my routine. I got up, showered, and made coffee. I avoided looking at the painting as I passed by. For some reason I felt uneasy. My neck felt stiff, and my eyes were tired. I figured I'd been sleeping poorly, so I popped a pain reliever and drank my coffee in silence. I had to get to work, so I left the house and tried to focus on my job. But all day, I kept recalling that dream. I kept hearing that hiss in the back of my mind. When I got home, I braced myself before opening the door. The painting was exactly where I had left it, hanging on the wall. I forced myself to walk over and look at it closely. The face was unchanged. The eyes looked the same. But that feeling of being watched was stronger now. My mouth felt dry. I reached out and touched the frame. It felt cold, more than I expected for wood. My spine tingled, but I shook it off and went about my evening. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through my phone. It didn't help. Every few minutes I glanced at the painting. Around 10 o'clock I was cleaning up the living room. I turned off the lamp and started to walk out. Suddenly, I had the sensation that someone was standing right behind me. My back tightened. My heart rate spiked and I felt an urgent need to run. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. The painting was there, and the rest of the room was empty. But the air felt dense, like the pressure in the room had changed. I forced myself to breathe. I walked to the hallway, refusing to look back again. That night I lay in bed, eyes on the ceiling. My body was tired, but my mind was racing. Thoughts kept circling around the hidden face I saw under the paint. I wondered if I should try to restore the original image. Maybe that hidden face held some clue about this ancestor. My chest felt tight. I wasn't sure if I wanted to know. The dream had already rattled me, and I didn't feel ready to uncover more secrets. I forced myself to close my eyes and eventually drifted off. My sleep was restless. I kept dreaming of the man in the portrait. In one dream, he reached out and grabbed my wrist. I felt pressure, like a real hand squeezing my arm. Then I saw a second face overlap his, flickering like a weak flashlight. I heard a faint knock, but I couldn't tell where it came from. I woke up gasping, my sheets damp. I looked at the clock. It was close to 4 a.m. My heart pounded against my ribs. I sat up, feeling the room spin. I grabbed my phone to see if there were any messages. Nothing. I drank some water and stayed awake until dawn. The following evening, I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. I moved a small desk lamp to the living room and placed it on the floor next to the painting. Then I grabbed a thin scraper and some cotton swabs from my garage. I knelt down in front of the portrait. My hands were shaking a bit as I started to gently test the layers of paint near the edges. I wanted to see if I could peel back enough to reveal what was underneath without damaging the entire piece. The top layer flaked off in tiny bits. I saw hints of another color, maybe a darker shade of blue or green. It didn't look like a background. It looked like part of a figure. I could see a rough outline of an eye, but it wasn't aligned with the main portrait's eyes. I felt a sudden rush of cold air across my shoulders. I shivered and twisted around, half expecting to see someone behind me. There was nobody there. My head hurt from tension. I turned back to the painting and continued to work. After maybe half an hour, my knees were sore from kneeling on the floor. I got up to stretch and my phone buzzed with a message from a friend. I glanced at it, but I didn't reply. I just couldn't focus on anything else right then. I placed the painting on my coffee table for a better angle. I leaned in, pushing the desk lamp closer. The flaking paint revealed part of a different mouth, thinner than the one on the surface portrait. I thought I saw the shape of a nose beneath the top layer. My hands felt clammy. I was desperate to see more, but I felt uneasy about pushing too far. A wave of nausea hit me. I stepped back and took a few deep breaths. It was getting late. I felt drained, physically and mentally. I decided to stop. I carefully put the painting back on the wall. I wiped up the paint flakes and put the tools away. My eyes were burning and my back felt stiff. I walked into the bathroom to splash water on my face. When I looked in the mirror, my eyes were red, and I had dark circles under them. I realized I hadn't eaten dinner. My stomach growled, but I had no appetite. I just wanted to sleep, or at least lie down and rest. When I went to bed, I kept my door open. I usually close it, but I felt the need to keep an ear out for any noises. I turned off the lights, leaving only the faint glow of a street lamp shining through the window. I lay there, eyes open, ears straining. For a long time, I heard nothing. Then, around midnight, I heard the floor creak in the living room. It was the same spot I noticed a few days earlier. My muscles tensed, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. My breathing grew shallow, and I had this urge to curl up. But I forced myself to get up and check. I flipped on the hallway light. It cast a dim glow into the living room. The painting was on the wall, motionless. The room was empty. My heart thumped so hard I could feel it in my neck. I waited for a few minutes, but nothing else happened. I returned to my bed. I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining the painting's eyes moving in the dark. At some point, I must have drifted off because I had another dream. I saw the ancestor's face morph into that second face. They kept swapping. Their mouths moved, forming words I couldn't understand. I felt a hand on my shoulder, and I jerked awake. My shoulder tingled, but there was no one in the room. I stared at the ceiling, my pulse racing. It took a while to calm down. Now it's been about 2 weeks since I first hung that painting. I can't stand looking at it, but I also can't bring myself to take it down. It's like I'm supposed to keep it there. Every time I pass by, I feel those eyes on me. My skin crawls, and my mind races with questions. I found evidence of a hidden face under the first one, but I haven't fully revealed it. I'm scared of what I'll see if I keep going. I worry about these dreams and the cold spots in my living room. They're getting worse. I'm not sure what the painting wants from me or if it wants anything at all. Maybe I'm imagining everything. But the physical reactions feel real enough. My back tightens, my hands get clammy, and I hear footsteps behind me when I'm alone. The nights are the hardest. The tension builds, and I catch myself listening for sounds that might not be there. My heart races, and I clench my jaw so hard it hurts. I have this constant feeling that the portrait is on the edge of revealing something. It's like a small pressure in the back of my skull. I'm not ready to deal with whatever's hidden beneath the paint. I keep having these dreams where the figure from the portrait tries to tell me a secret, but his words come out in whispers and static. My thoughts bounce between curiosity and dread. I still don't know if I can face the truth that painting holds, but I do know I can't ignore it forever. For now, I'm trying to keep my sanity in check, day by day, hoping that the answers won't come crashing down on me in the middle of the night. I almost walked out of the theater that night without thinking twice. I had finished my regular checks, I was tired, and the only thing on my mind was getting home. But I heard something through the speaker connected to the main microphone. It sounded like a faint hum, a female voice carrying a tune I didn't recognize. That was the moment everything changed for me. I stopped near the mixing console, stared at the empty stage, and felt my pulse spike. I didn't see anyone up there, and the sound system was on standby. I thought maybe there was a glitch or some interference from another frequency. It didn't make sense, but I figured I could test the lines one more time before leaving. I stayed until almost midnight, checking every cable and every input. I found nothing wrong. That hum stayed in my mind. The next day, I came back in the afternoon for routine tests before the evening performance. I was the first one in, which was normal. I prefer working alone to avoid questions or interruptions. I turned on the power amps, tested the microphones, and everything was silent. No static, no voices. The show went fine that evening. After the final act, I lingered on stage, picking up stray cables and rolling them properly. I locked the back door, turned off the main stage lights, and went down to the booth again to make sure everything was off. That's when I heard it for the second time. The same voice, only now it was singing a series of notes in a different pattern. I felt a tingling on the back of my neck, like my skin had tightened. I swallowed hard and tried to stay calm. I switched on the stage lights from the booth and looked out at the curtains. No one was there. The seats were all empty, the aisles were empty, the stage was empty. But the sound was definitely coming through the monitors. The hair on my arms stood up. My chest felt tight. I turned off each channel one by one, but the sound continued until I muted the entire board. Then it stopped. I told 2 of my co-workers about it the next morning. They looked at me like I was talking nonsense. They said I was probably tired and hearing things. I didn't argue, but inside I knew I was fully alert. I'm used to long nights. My job demands that I pay attention to every tone, every hum, every hiss from the speakers. It's my profession. I don't make things up. When we had a break that afternoon, I decided to run a full diagnostic on the sound system. I spent hours on it. I checked the microphone cables, the wireless packs, the frequencies, every piece of equipment. I couldn't find a single fault. Still, I hoped the voice wouldn't come back, but part of me wanted some closure. I wanted to confirm it was a technical error, but a more honest part of me wanted to hear it again. I was starting to feel curious, maybe even obsessed. That evening, we had a musical performance on stage. I stayed backstage to manage the microphones while the stage manager handled the cues. Everything was normal. After the final bow, I started my usual routine again. I walked around, picked up equipment, rolled cables, and powered off the stage lights. Then I returned to the booth to do another shutdown. A slight chill ran down my arms as I tested the main microphone again, alone in the booth. I said testing 1, 2 into the microphone, watching the level meters on the console. Everything was silent. I felt a small sense of relief. Then I heard a whisper. It sounded like my name. I froze. It was a woman's voice, soft and slow. I looked at the console. The meters barely moved, but I heard it. My ears weren't lying. I felt a sudden rush in my chest. My mouth got dry. My palms started to sweat. I turned around to look at the seats. Nothing. The stage was dark. No movement at all. I leaned forward and tried to speak into the mic again, asking, "Who's there?" I got nothing but a low crackle. I stood up from my chair, walked to the stage entrance, and flipped on the work lights. The entire space lit up, revealing rows of seats, the aisles, and the stage. Still no one. I can't explain why I felt compelled to speak softly. "Is anyone here?" My voice echoed. No answer. I walked around backstage, checked the dressing rooms, the hallways, the corners. Every room was empty. I went back to the booth, shut everything off, and forced myself to leave. I felt shaky and unsettled. The next day, I talked to a friend of mine who handles lighting. He smirked and told me I needed a vacation. I couldn't blame him. It sounded like a ghost story. But I knew this was real. Something was going on in that theater. I felt it in my gut. That evening I arrived earlier than usual, hoping to investigate more. I climbed up to the catwalk to see if there was any hidden speaker or old wiring that might be causing weird feedback. I found dusty cables and old fixtures, but nothing that explained a woman's voice. At around 5, the stage manager came in. She said the night's performance would be a small play, nothing major. I kept my observations to myself. During that show, I stayed near the sound console, listening carefully. Everything worked fine. After the performance, I repeated my routine. I cleared the stage, stored the microphones, secured the cables, turned off the stage lights. At about 11 p.m., I was at the console in the booth again, checking a cable patch. I felt a heavy tension in the air. I heard a faint hum. I switched on the monitors. The hum got louder. The voice returned, singing those strange notes. My chest felt like it was vibrating. My vision locked onto the stage. I opened one of the channels on the console, hoping to isolate the sound. Instead, I heard a whisper. "Come here." My entire body jolted. My teeth clenched. I felt sweat gathering on my forehead. I wanted to call out, but I froze. The voice repeated, "Come here." It sounded gentle, but it made my stomach twist. I pushed back from the console and walked down to the main floor. My heart pounded. My legs felt unsteady. I moved down the center aisle, looking at the stage. My mind raced with questions. Why did I feel drawn to it? Why did I think I had to follow it? The voice said my name again, so quiet I almost didn't catch it. I stepped onto the stage. The floor creaked. It was dark except for the ghost light we keep in the back. I looked at the old curtains, the ropes, the backdrop. Everything seemed normal, but I sensed movement somewhere. I moved behind the curtain, past stored props and an old piano that hasn't been used in years. The voice went silent. I stood there for a minute waiting, my ears straining to catch any sound. I could only hear the hum of the building's HVAC system. My pulse hammered in my ears. Then I heard a soft laugh from off to the left side. I spun around, nearly tripping over a coiled extension cord. I aimed my flashlight in that direction. A door led down into the basement storage area. I rarely go down there because it's cluttered and musty. The voice seemed to come from somewhere near that door. I walked closer, shining my light on the walls, the floor, the random pieces of old sets stacked around. I tested the handle on the door. It was unlocked. I opened it and peeked inside. Dust floated in the light beam. It smelled damp and stale. I stepped inside, checking the steps to avoid falling. My foot made a scraping sound on the concrete. The door closed behind me. The sound made me jump and I let out a quick breath. My hands trembled. I called out, "Hello?" And my voice echoed against the stone walls. No answer. I stood on the last step, scanning the basement for movement. Rows of shelves with old props and spare lighting equipment lined the walls. A few empty chairs sat in one corner. The air felt heavier down there. I switched on a light bulb that hung overhead. The space lit up, revealing dust and cobwebs. I looked around carefully, checking behind the shelves and under the tables. Nobody. I started to wonder if I had made a mistake coming down. My skin crawled, and I felt an urge to get out. Then, as I turned to head back, the voice whispered my name again. It sounded so close that my hair stood on end. I whirled around, shining the flashlight. I saw a shadow move near a stack of old set walls. My pulse was so strong that my hand shook. I tried to speak, but my throat felt tight. I forced my feet to move forward. I approached the stack of old set pieces, feeling like I might pass out from nerves. Nothing jumped out. I kept shining the flashlight. I kicked aside some cardboard boxes to see if anyone was crouching there. Nothing but dust and scraps. Then I felt a slight brush of air near my neck, like someone exhaling. My body tensed. I spun around, flashlight beam sweeping across the floor. The voice whispered one word so softly I almost didn't catch it. "Stay." My knees felt weak. I couldn't see anyone, but the sound was too real to be in my head. I stopped, trying to breathe, trying to keep my mind clear. I felt my heartbeat hammering. I realized I was dripping sweat. I needed to leave. I turned off the light bulb, climbed back up the steps, and opened the door. The backstage area looked the same as always, but my senses were on high alert. I expected something or someone to appear. No one was there. I put the flashlight on a shelf and walked onto the stage. I locked the basement door behind me, ignoring the voice. I hurried to the booth, shut off everything as fast as I could, and rushed out the main exit. I didn't even lock up properly that night. My hands wouldn't stop shaking until I got home and tried to sleep. For the next few days, I felt on edge. I tried to avoid being alone in the theater, but my job requires that I stay late sometimes. I found excuses to leave early when I could. but eventually I had to close up again. On that night, I told myself I'd be quick. I performed my final checks on the board, coiling cables in silence. I had set my phone to play music quietly in the background because I didn't want to hear any more voices. But I didn't get a choice. After a few minutes, my music cut out. I looked at my phone. It was still on, but the audio had paused on its own. Then I heard the female voice again through the monitors. I felt my hands start to tremble. My mouth went dry. The voice said, "Don't ignore me." I almost dropped my phone. My breathing got shallow and fast. I muttered under my breath, "What do you want?" I still felt ridiculous, like I was talking to empty air. The voice seemed to come from right behind me. "Follow," it said. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might faint. I walked toward the stage door, looking around to see if maybe someone had managed to sneak in, but the hallway was empty. The corridors all looked dark. I stood there, unsure if I should do what it asked. My instincts told me to run. My curiosity told me to keep going. I crept through the backstage area, stepping carefully, trying to make as little noise as possible. I heard a low hum, like a single note held by a distant singer. It guided me toward the left side of the stage. I followed it around a series of crates and costume racks. I stopped when I reached a locked supply closet. The hum disappeared. I tried the doorknob. It was locked. I felt a jolt of frustration. I needed to know what was inside, but I didn't have the key. I backed away, deciding to give up for the night. I returned to the booth, grabbed my backpack, and left the building. My mind raced with questions about what was in that closet. I had never bothered with it before. It's used for storing old sound gear we don't use anymore. I told myself I'd ask the manager for the key the next day. When I got home, I couldn't settle down. I replayed the voice in my head over and over. I barely slept. The next morning, I asked our stage manager if I could get into that supply closet. She shrugged and gave me a key. She asked if I needed something from there, but I lied. I said I was just doing an inventory check. I waited until the theater was empty again. I wanted no interruptions. I felt anxious, but I also felt a strange pull to go inside that room. Around 10 p.m., I walked to the supply closet with the key in my hand. The hallway smelled like fresh paint because a new set piece had been touched up. My footsteps sounded too loud on the concrete floor. My heartbeat raced. I reached the door, inserted the key, and heard the lock click. I stepped in and flicked the light switch. The single overhead bulb lit the small room. Shelves along the walls held ancient mixers, broken microphones, and tangled cables. A few cases sat on the floor, collecting dust. I walked around, checking if anything looked out of place. Everything seemed normal. No signs of anything that could explain the voice. Then the light flickered. I felt a chill in my arms and an odd pressure in my chest. The same hum started again, as if coming from inside the closet itself. It was soft, but it echoed in my ears. I opened one of the old mixer cases. I saw a dusty console, wires, some spare fuses. I noticed a taped-up corner where someone had scratched a name, but I couldn't read it. The hum got louder, and I felt a burst of adrenaline. I turned to look at the door, but it was still open. The corridor was empty. I spoke quietly. "I'm here. What do you want me to see?" The hum went silent. For several seconds, I heard only my breathing. Then I heard a soft sigh, right behind me. I spun around, shining my small flashlight. Nothing. My lungs burned from shallow breaths. I felt sweat rolling down my back. I leaned against the shelf, trying to calm my heartbeat. Then, without warning, the overhead light went out completely. I was left with only my flashlight. I heard a hushed whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but I felt them in my ear, warm and intimate. My entire body tensed. I scrambled for the door. I wanted out. I pointed my flashlight at the doorway and moved as fast as I could. Right before I stepped over the threshold, I heard my name again. The voice was so clear, it felt like a person standing an inch away. I stopped, but I couldn't turn around. My stomach churned and my knees felt weak. I walked out and shut the door behind me, locking it with shaking hands. I hurried to the exit, not caring if I left some lights on in the hallway. I just needed air. When I got outside, I took deep breaths, leaning against the brick wall. My body was covered in sweat and my head ached from the tension. I thought about what had just happened. This presence or voice wanted me in that closet. But why? I had no clue. It seemed to want me to keep searching. Or maybe it wanted me trapped inside its world of strange sounds. I felt like the theater itself was alive, but I refused to go back that night. I decided to stop telling my coworkers. They wouldn't believe me anyway. Over the following nights, I heard the voice again and again, sometimes just a faint melody, sometimes calling my name. I felt drawn to it, yet terrified to go deeper. I forced myself to finish my job tasks as quickly as possible and leave. My body stayed tense whenever I was alone in the building. Each time the voice reached out, I felt that twisting in my gut, that dryness in my mouth, the rush of blood pounding in my ears. I'm still working in that old theater. Every evening I brace myself for the moment the performances end and everyone leaves. I stay behind, checking the equipment, rolling cables, looking over my shoulder, and waiting for that voice. I haven't gone back to the basement. I haven't opened that supply closet again. But I feel the voice sometimes, hovering at the edges of hearing, wanting me to discover something, or maybe wanting me to surrender to its call. I keep telling myself I can handle it. I keep telling myself I'm just hearing faulty signals, but I know it's not a glitch. I can't prove it, but I feel it. And every night, when I'm the last person here, I feel my muscles tighten, ready for whatever that voice might do next. I heard the first complaint about my guest room on a night when my old friend Mark stayed over after a long road trip. Around 3 a.m, he burst into the living room, sweaty and wide-eyed. He told me he'd been jolted awake by loud knocks on the wall, like someone striking it with a closed fist right next to his head. He said his heart pounded so hard that he couldn't catch his breath. I shrugged it off and blamed thin walls or maybe the pipes. But I felt a chill when he insisted he heard footsteps outside the door, and when he looked, no one was there. I didn't think much of it until 2 more visitors had the same experience on separate nights. They woke up terrified, complaining about nightmares filled with strange images they couldn't quite remember. One of them said it felt like someone was in the room with him, standing by the window and staring in his direction. My guests described hearing scraping sounds like a chair being dragged across the floor. They described loud knocks that seemed to come from inside the walls. Each time I tried to console them by reminding them the house was old. I assumed this was just creaking pipes or the sound of wind against old wood panels. Then I discovered that the guest room stood right over the spot where, decades ago, there used to be a makeshift infirmary of sorts. The previous owners apparently cared for sick relatives in that room. The local historical records mentioned a small corner with cabinets, a cot, and some basic medical supplies. Once I learned about that detail, I started noticing things. It began one Saturday afternoon when I was alone in the house. I was upstairs sitting in my bedroom, trying to fix a cabinet door that wouldn't close properly. The hallway was quiet, but then I heard slow, deliberate footsteps. The floorboards creaked, and it sounded like someone was taking cautious steps right outside my door. My mouth went dry, and I stopped what I was doing. I walked out and saw no one in the hallway. I checked every room upstairs, including the guest room, but everything was still. The bed was in place, the closet door was closed, and the windows were shut. There was no reason to hear footsteps unless the weight of someone was shifting the old wooden floor. Over the next few weeks, I kept feeling a presence whenever I spent time upstairs. Sometimes it was like a cold draft that trailed just behind me. I'd be brushing my teeth in the bathroom, and I'd feel this sudden temperature drop near my shoulders, as if someone was standing there. I'd spin around expecting to see a person, but there was only empty air. My heartbeat would speed up, and I'd force myself to exhale slowly, telling myself it was all in my head. The more I paid attention, the more I heard small clues. Quiet bumps against the walls, a soft rattling in the ceiling, and something that sounded like furniture scraping across the floor. It always came from the direction of the guest room. On a few occasions, I stepped inside that room and tried to sit quietly, hoping I would catch the sounds. But whenever I was in there alone, it felt too still. Even the air seemed heavier, but there was no immediate noise. Then my coworker Danny spent the night. He had come over for a weekend to help me work on some minor renovations. He slept in the guest room because the rest of the house was full of boxes and tools. Around 2 a.m, I heard him shout my name. It wasn't a casual call, it was urgent, like he was yelling for help. I rushed upstairs. As I entered the doorway, I saw him standing in the middle of the room, panting. His hair was matted to his forehead, and he was clutching the edge of the mattress. He told me he woke up when he felt something pressing down on his legs. He said he heard a rustling sound in the corner near the closet. Danny insisted that when he turned on the bedside lamp, he saw the closet door inching shut like it had just been open a moment earlier. I couldn't explain that. I tried to calm him down by checking the closet. It was empty except for some spare pillows and an old blanket. There was nothing inside that could move. The windows were locked. The door to the hallway was still closed. He ended up spending the rest of the night on my couch. I didn't blame him. After that, I realized I needed to figure out what was happening in that room. I started keeping a small audio recorder on the dresser in the guest room whenever someone stayed over. I told them it was just to see if I could catch the knocking sounds. I never played the recordings in front of my guests because I didn't want to freak them out. But I listened to them when I was alone. For the first few nights, I got nothing but background noise. The hum of the air conditioner, the occasional creak of the house settling, or the muffled toss and turn of whoever was sleeping. Then, on a night when my friend Jeremy stayed over, I captured something disturbing. Around 3:15 a.m., there were 3 distinct knocks on the wall, followed by the sound of what might have been a chair scraping against the floor. It was subtle, but it was there. The next morning, Jeremy told me he had a nightmare about being tied down to a bed. He said he heard banging inside the dream like something was hitting the walls. He woke up in a panic. He didn't even notice the sounds in reality, but the recorder picked them up. This coincidence sent a chill down my spine. I started researching the old infirmary records more thoroughly. I spoke to a few older people in the neighborhood. They told me that during the early half of the last century, it was common for families to nurse the sick at home. They said the infirmary in my house might have seen a lot of suffering, but nobody confirmed any deaths. They only knew that several people spent long, uncomfortable nights in that room, moaning in pain or coughing through the night. At least that's what local stories suggested. I couldn't find any official documentation mentioning anything violent or tragic in that room. Still, the fact that people were treated for serious illnesses there made me uneasy. When I had no visitors for a week, I noticed a strange silence in the guest room. I checked it every day. It felt stagnant, like a room in a vacant house that nobody visited. However, every time I walked in, I got a tingling feeling in my arms and neck. At night, if I lay in bed and focused, I sometimes heard faint noises coming from that direction, but they were softer. It was like the entity, or whatever it was, went quiet when it had no audience. The tension was still there, though, hovering. I decided to spend a night in the guest room myself. I wanted to experience what my friends had described. Maybe I was pushing my luck, but I needed to see if this thing would show itself to me. I brought a flashlight, my phone, and a small notepad. I turned off all the lights, locked up the house, and got settled in the guest bed around midnight. For the first hour, I scrolled through social media, trying to stay calm. The room was the same as always. A dresser in the corner, a small nightstand, and an old wooden chair near the window. After a while, I set my phone aside and closed my eyes. My heart thumped at a steady pace, and I tried to concentrate on any unusual sounds. For a long time, it was silent. The only noise was the soft whoosh of air coming from the vent. I started to think maybe I wouldn't experience anything at all. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard a slight tapping. It was more of a light scratch than a knock, like a fingernail sliding across the wall right behind me. I sat up and flicked on my flashlight. There was nothing to see. The wall was plain, with no pictures or shelves. I tapped my knuckles against the same spot, trying to figure out if a loose pipe or a tree branch outside could make that sound. There was no tree branch near that portion of the house, and none of the pipes should have been moving enough to cause a scratching noise. The moment I turned off the flashlight, I heard it again, this time on the opposite wall. My stomach tightened. I got up and moved to the other side of the room. I stood still and waited, holding my breath. Everything felt heavier and my arms were tense. A few minutes later, I heard a soft thump on the floor near the chair by the window. I whipped my head around and aimed the flashlight there. The chair hadn't moved. The curtains were still, but I felt sure something had touched the floor. I knelt down and placed my palm against the spot. It was just an old wooden floorboard, cool to the touch. No sign of anything that could have caused the noise. My heart was pounding. My breaths were shallow and fast. I remember wiping sweat off my forehead. I sat back on the bed and grabbed my phone. I checked the time. 2:36 a.m. I decided to record a voice memo, just to see if I could catch any sounds. I rested the phone on the nightstand and whispered, "If there's something in this room, let me know." My own voice sounded shaky. I waited for a response, feeling a tingle at the back of my neck. That same cold sensation I'd felt before crept over my shoulders. I looked around in the dark, but I saw only the dresser, the chair, and the bed. The corners were dim and the closet door was slightly ajar. I stared at that dark gap, convinced I might see it move. It stayed still. The tension in my chest was becoming unbearable. I could feel my pulse in my temples. I tried to focus on any subtle sound. Eventually, I thought I heard the faintest of squeaks, like a door hinge turning. I stared at the closet door, but it wasn't moving. I stood up, walked to the door, and pushed it open all the way. The closet was empty except for the same items as before. I waved my flashlight over every surface. Nothing. Then, behind me, I heard a single loud knock on the wall. It wasn't right next to me. It sounded like it came from near the headboard of the bed. I stepped back and turned, shining the light in that direction. My breath caught in my throat. I felt a sensation like static running across my skin. No sign of any movement, but the knock was so clear I couldn't pretend it was just the house settling. I rushed over and grabbed my phone. My hands trembled as I looked to see if it had recorded the knock. I hit stop and played it back. The recording was mostly silence. Then I heard my whisper, followed by a few seconds of quiet, and then a faint knock. It was there. I didn't imagine it. I decided I'd had enough for one night. My mind was racing, and my stomach felt tied in knots. I left the guest room and went downstairs. My heart kept beating hard for several minutes. I sat on the couch, trying to calm down. My arms were shaking. Over the next few days, I kept thinking about why the activity always increased with visitors. It was like this presence needed the energy or the fear of someone who wasn't used to the house. My best guess is that it wants an audience or it wants to reach out to people who aren't me. I live here all the time, so maybe it doesn't bother with me unless I force myself into its space. The tension never left. Every day, I feel it. Sometimes I hear faint knocks or footsteps even when I'm not focusing. At least now, I have proof that it's not my imagination. I haven't driven myself out of the house yet because it's mine, and I don't want to abandon it. I'm determined to find out what this entity wants. I've thought about bringing in someone who knows about paranormal investigations, but I haven't done it yet. I'm not sure if I'm ready to turn my home into a spectacle. I've considered asking my next visitor if they'd allow me to set up more equipment in the guest room, maybe a video camera and some sensors. I need more evidence. I need to understand why it stays quiet when the room is empty, why it knocks on the walls, and why it keeps causing nightmares. Sometimes, when I walk by the closed door of the guest room in broad daylight, I sense a shift in the atmosphere. The rest of the house might feel normal, but the air around that door feels colder. I pause and listen. Usually there's nothing, but my spine tingles anyway. I take a breath and move on. I have to keep living my life. I have my job, my routines, and my friends. I can't let this consume me completely. Still, each new time someone asks to spend the night, I brace myself. I warn them the room can be creepy. Some laugh it off, thinking I'm just being dramatic. Others choose to stay on the couch, preferring not to risk it. But I know that eventually, someone else will sleep in there, and the cycle will repeat. They'll describe the knocking, the nightmares, the feeling of being watched. They might hear scraping sounds or footsteps. They'll probably come running out in the middle of the night. I'm not sure how this will end. I can only keep gathering clues, waiting for the day when I understand what or who occupies that space. For now, I live with the tension. It's an uneasy coexistence. I walk upstairs, and I feel the prickle of unseen eyes. I keep my distance from the guest room unless I need to step inside for cleaning or to grab something. I don't talk to it. I don't provoke it, at least not anymore. I learned that if I push too hard, I'm the one who ends up terrified. There's no big climax to my story, at least not yet. I'm here, the entity is here, and we both go about our business in a stalemate. But I know it's there. I see the evidence in my visitors' panicked faces and in their stories of restless nights. I hear it in the recordings. I feel it in the hair standing up on the back of my neck. And every time I hear those knocks on the walls, I remember that I'm not as alone in this house as I'd like to be.